Rabbi said, L'chaim v'levracha. Shalom Aleichem, first of all. Shalom Aleichem, hello to everybody. And thank you for bringing me to South Florida. I can't tell you how much it means to me that we're having a Yud Tes Kislev Farbrengen in the young Israel. It's a siman that we're ready for Mashiach to come, zicher. Because Shalom, I had a grandfather who used to say that the Eibishter has a weakness. God Almighty has a vulnerability. It says in Midrash Chazal, it's not a gleich vetel from some darshan. It says in Midrashim, it says in Chazal. There's a way to work around the Eibishter's order, and the Eibishter's weakness is peace, it's shalom. The only problem is it's our weakness also. And if we figure out that it's kulanu b'nei ish echad nachnu, so that's the greatest bracha that could possibly be. It's very heartening, it's very beautiful, and I feel very fortunate to be participating in this Farbrengen. And I want to say l'chaim for Achdas Yisrael, and for Avos Yisrael, and for Shalom Yisrael, and for Mashiach Tzidkeinu. L'chaim everybody, l'chaim v'levracha, l'chaim v'levracha, l'chaim v'levracha, l'chaim v'levracha. The way these events work, that when the event is over, I know what I should have said. So now I have to guess. I'll try to speak with a little bit of knowledge that I have of the community to you, to the Olam. I'm going to begin with a brief version of the story of Yud Tes Kislev. But today is actually the day before. Yud Tes Kislev is Tuesday and Wednesday. Yud Tes Kislev is Tuesday. Today is Sunday night to Monday. So it's Achei Kislev. It's the day before Yud Tes Kislev. But it's close enough. In Halacha, there's a category called Lovud, right? 3 days, it all works together. Lovud works in a lot of scenarios. And one of them is days, it's time. So we're close enough to Yud Tes Kislev. So I'm going to share with you a brief history of the story of Yud Tes Kislev. When Chassidus was born, the Chassidus has an official birthday. The official birthday of Chassidus is 1734. But the Baal Shem Tov was 36 years old, 1734. Which means we're almost 290 years old. And the Chassidus still remains enigmatic. People are still not sure what it is. It's one of the interesting things. But when Chassidus was born, predictably, there was a lot of pushback. There was a lot of doubt. There was a lot of uncertainty. Jewish people are great believers, you understand? But until you get them to believe, you have to go through Shiva Medure skepticism. Ayid questions and doubts, right? So we're taught to question and to doubt and to understand. But once we determine that it's emes, we're in. And like any new idea and philosophy and shita, Chassidus is a shita. Chassidus is a philosophy with a way of life, with customs of its own. And if you're familiar with Chassidus, you know there's 101 different types. Chassidus is not a monolith. There's all different types of Chassidus. There's Hungarian Chassidus, and there's Romanian Chassidus, and there's Polish Chassidus, and there's Russian Chassidus, and there's Ukrainian Chassidus, and each one has a different flavor and a different sentiment, and they're all the brainchildren of the Heilige Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov is the father and the founder of Chassidus. So when Chassidus was founded, there was a lot of pushback. There was a lot of doubt. And the doubts directed towards Chassidus lasted for 3 generations. The generation of the Holy Baal Shem Tov. His successor was the Holy Maggid, Rabbi Ber of Mezrich, whose yahrzeit is also on Yud Tes Kislev. He passed away on the same day that the Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chabad, would be released from prison 36 years after. And then the 3rd generation was the generation of the founder of Chabad. And historically, the most severe contention was the 3rd. It got worse over time. Eventually, it subsided. In the times of Tzemach Tzedek, which is the 5th generation of Chassidus, Chassidim and Misnagdim were best friends. It's just the way the history played out. But during the times of the Alter Rebbe, the author of the Tanya and the Shulchan Aruch and the founder of Chabad, there was a lot of uncertainty around Chassidus. And because of this, the Alter Rebbe was arrested. He was actually arrested twice. He was arrested in 1798 and he was arrested again in 1800. The first time he was arrested, the government of Russia didn't even know why. Someone sent a libel that to this day, we don't even know who he is. It's very strange. When the Alter Rebbe was sitting in prison for those who are not familiar, about 30 years ago, they found the actual file of the Alter Rebbe's cross-examination of both arrests, and you can read them in the original as the Alter Rebbe answered questions and defended himself and explained what Chassidus is and what Chabad is. It's all, they found it in a Russian archive, and it's been published. It's fascinating to read what is Chassidus in the voice of the founder of Chabad. And they asked him, who's Hirsch ben Borach? They asked him, who libeled you? He says, I don't know the person. Adayei Mazeh, we don't know who it was that libeled Alter Rebbe. And he was taken away like a common criminal. He was taken away like a criminal accused of crimes against the state. And he sat in jail for 53 days in a fortress in Petersburg. And then he was released. The second time, it was more respectful. He was not arrested, he was invited. But the second time was much more severe in reality, because then he had to answer questions from very knowledgeable Misnagdim who opposed Chassidus, and they came prepared with legitimate questions, challenging the veracity, the authenticity of Chassidus. They questioned the consistency of the new Chassidic ways with Jewish tradition. The Alter Rebbe, again, all of this is now in print. You could read the questions and the answers as they were preserved in the Russian archive over 200 years ago. And the Alter Rebbe had to defend and argue that Chassidus is not chas v'shalom making a new religion or making any kind of changes, but to the contrary, it's preserving and it's fortifying what Torah mitzvahs is, what Yiddishkeit is, what the heart, the spirit of Yiddishkeit is. So he was held in, the second time he was treated nicer, but it was actually a more difficult circumstance. Eventually, the Alter Rebbe was cleared, and he made a holiday to commemorate his release from prison. But he didn't make the holiday on the day that he was released the second time. He made a holiday on the day that he was released the first time. The first time he was released on the yahrzeit of his master, of his holy teacher, the Holy Maggid. He made that the official holiday of the celebration of his release from prison. Although 2 years later he was taken again and he was released sometime on Hanukkah, but that date is not celebrated, commemorated in the same way. And perhaps soon I'll touch on why. Perhaps I'll touch on what is the reason for it. When he was held, there are many, many stories that happened during the time that he was held in prison. Amongst the stories were, I'm just going to share a little bit. I don't want to go into all the intricacies. It gets very technical. The ministry, the officers of the state, you're talking about Tsarist Russia, some of them are very learned, and some of them knew Hebrew, some of them knew Talmud, Tanakh, they certainly knew. And they heard that there's a rabbin, there's a great sage, a great Jewish rabbi in their midst, and they visited him in his cell. And there's some very interesting anecdotes that occurred when the Alter Rebbe was visited by these officers of the government of Russia at the time. The minister of religion and culture found Alter Rebbe fascinating, and he visited him repeatedly. And I'll tell you this story first. That one day he was walking through the halls of this, literally a dungeon. It's a fortress in the center of Leningrad called the Peter Paul Fortress. The entire thing was surrounded by waters moving at a rapid pace, and there's a lot of rocks. And he was held in a cell with no windows. And this minister of religion and culture was walking towards the Alter Rebbe's cell. The Alter Rebbe is Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi. Can I say Alter Rebbe? Is that Yiddish manageable? Alter Rebbe means old rabbi, that's what it means. But if I have to translate it each time, it gets very interrupted. So the Alter Rebbe is Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the author of the Tanya, the Shulchan Aruch, the founder of the Chabad movement. I'm just going to use Alter Rebbe. That'll be the limit on my Yiddish until I speak some more Yiddish. So he hears here's a tussle, here's a wrestle going on in the cell where the Alter Rebbe is sitting. And he walks and he sees a whole bunch of officers, a bunch of soldiers, trying to force feed the Alter Rebbe. They were trying to force open his mouth and feed him. The food wasn't kosher, and the Alter Rebbe wouldn't eat. And they suspected, as is often the case with people accused of crimes against the state, people who were liable for treason, that he was starving himself. He wanted to take his own life. So they wanted to force feed him. And the Alter Rebbe closed his lips, held his jaw, and they couldn't open it. So 4 or 5 big men were trying to force the Alter Rebbe to eat, and he wouldn't eat. This minister walks in, and he had known the Alter Rebbe from earlier visits, and he screams at these people, "What are you doing?" He says he doesn't want to eat. and we decided that his refusal to eat is because he's trying to commit suicide. He says, this is not the way you talk to such a man. I know this person. You have to reason with him. Don't beat him up. So he has them back away, and he says, I don't understand. Why don't you want to eat? He says, it's not kosher. So he says to the Alter Rebbe, I'm abadas lyhadus, and he can't learn it. He was a Talmid Chacham, a goy. He was learned. If a person has to show him, takes his own life, he loses his elam haba. And the Alter Rebbe said without hesitation, yeah, elam haba, no elam haba, today if I'm not eating. So this guy asked the Alter Rebbe, can I help get you kosher food? Halachically, there's a whole thing about shenesalim and ha'ayin has to be in Jewish hands. And the Alter Rebbe made a number of conditions. And one of them was that he would personally pick up the food and personally deliver the food, and he wouldn't touch it. And he brought kosher to the Alter Rebbe for his stay in prison, and that's how the Alter Rebbe survived. This same man had a wonderful encounter that's very famous during the time that the Alter Rebbe was incarcerated. He came into the cell. He was a learned man. And he said to the Alter Rebbe that he studies Tanakh, studies the scriptures, studies Torah. And at the very beginning of the Chumash, there's a passage that he finds curious. That Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve, ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and they became aware, they became aware of their own shame. So they hid. They hid amongst the brush. They became aware of shame. So they hid, they had no clothing. And then the pasuk continues, they heard, they heard the spirit of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which was represented by some kind of a ruach. I'm assuming ruach means a wind. And God Almighty says to Adam and Chava, Ayeka, where are you? Is it possible from the tree that I told you not to eat, did you eat? So the question is asked, that Rashi already asks the question. What does it mean? God Almighty says to Adam and Eve, Ayeka, where are you? I mean, God Almighty knows. He knows where they are. Why does it have to say, Ayeka, where are you? It's an unnecessary word. So the Alter Rebbe said to this non-Jew, what Rashi says. God Almighty wanted to start a conversation with Adam Rishon. We all know the basic idea of Dibra Torah, of Lashon B'Yod, the Torah describes God Almighty in a way that makes him appear human for the purposes of us understanding our communication, our involvement with him. So God Almighty began the conversation with a hayeka, with a hello, a way of means of introducing himself to Adam Rishon, and he shouldn't appear too abrupt, and he shouldn't frighten him, and so forth. So this man, this minister, says to the Alter Rebbe, what Rashi says I know, but I don't like Rashi. I need a better job. What Rashi says I know. What Rashi says I know. But do you have anything more? So the Alter Rebbe said to this man, tell me, do you believe in God? He says, I believe in God. Do you believe in Torah? Believe that it's divinely inspired, that the Torah is from God? He says, I believe in Torah. Do you believe that the Torah is timeless and it applies to all people in all times, in all situations? And he says, I believe that also. I believe that Torah, the scripture, speaks to every person. He wasn't even Jewish. All times and all places and all conditions. And Alter Rebbe was very happy. He was speaking to an intelligent non-Jew, but he was a believer. He was very happy with his answer. He says, if that's the case, I'll tell you. When God Almighty says to Adam and Chava, Ayeka, that word is not spoken by God to one person. It's a rhetoric. At every moment of every day, God says to each man and woman, Ayeka, where are you holding? You've lived so many years, and so many months, and so many weeks, and so many days. What have you achieved in the direction of fulfilling the purpose for which your neshama came into this world? And when Alter Rebbe said this to this person, he told him his exact age, to the day. He says, you've lived so many years, and so many months, and so many weeks, and so many days, and he told him his precise age, and God Almighty is asking you, what have you achieved in the direction of fulfilling the purpose which neshama came into this world? And of course this man was very moved, and it even says in the Sichos, in the Holy Rise, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, that the Alter Rebbe had to hear this himself. It was important for the Alter Rebbe. This message was not only said to the person with whom he's speaking. This message the Alter Rebbe gave himself, and the message is: Neshama comes into this world to live here, and not to look for ways of exiting this world. And it had a certain effect on the Alter Rebbe that would affect the Alter Rebbe's future as a leader of Chassidus. During the time that he was out, he was asked many questions, and like I said, if you have an interest, you can read the original, mamish the original. The words of the Alter Rebbe in the original are published in the Alter Rebbe's letters. Now it's available, you can buy it in the bookstore, and you can read the entire cross-examination for the first arrest, and the much more scholarly and involved cross-examination and questions and answers from the second arrest. And Alter Rebbe explained what Chassidus is, what Chassidus wishes to accomplish. And one of the interesting stories that they tell, they kept asking him questions, and he kept answering the questions, answering the questions. And he was good. Alter Rebbe was he dealt with the questions well. Some of the questions he answered orally. The more involved questions, he was afraid they would misunderstand. He wrote them down, and then they had to be translated, which was another whole part of the story. But at one point they asked him a question, and instead of answering the question, he laughed. And when he laughed, the person cross-examining him went on to the next question. He didn't push the question. So when the Alter Rebbe repeated the story, the Chassidim said to him, Rebbe, he asked you a question, you laughed. Why didn't he press you? He says, because my laugh was, I explained everything you asked so well. Are you sure you want the answer to this one? I don't think you want to know the answer to this question. And he understood that he's better off not knowing the answer to the question. The end of the story was that after sitting for 53 days, and of course, the Remedies that we always use is that the Tanya has 53 chapters. He said 53 days in jail. The Tanya has 53 prakim. The Chumash has 53 parshiyos. It says in Zoya that there's Gan Sidri Eraisa, there's 53 parshas to the Chumash. Now, if you'll count, you'll find 54, not 53. But it's brought in Svarim that Nitzavim and Vayelach are one parsha that are sometimes divided. It's not two parshas that are sometimes joined. It's one parsha that is sometimes divided. And the Tanya also has 53 chapters. The Alter Rebbe sat in prison, Yom Pedek, one day for each chapter. And he was let go. And Chassidim celebrated it. Chassidim celebrated this event. The Alter Rebbe wrote a letter, which is published in the Tanya, in which he asks Chassidim to be dignified winners, not to use this event as a means of showing up the misnagdim and exacerbating and pouring fuel on the fire of the machlekes, but to be humble winners. He begs the Chassidim that they should behave towards their brothers who disagreed with them at that time with humility, rather than show them up, rather than make an issue of it. And one of the many expressions in that famous letter is, he says there's a difference between Chesed of Yishmael and Chesed of Yankov Avinu. Right? This week's parsha, last week's parsha. The Igeres HaKodesh begins. This is the second letter, and the Tanya begins. The Alter Rebbe says the famous words that when a person is more blessed, what becomes of them? If a person is wealthier and healthier and smarter and more gifted and more successful, do they become a bigger balgaiver? Do they become more self-absorbed? Or are they humbled by their successes? And he argues that in Tzaddik Keneged, in the Umazeh, in Klipa, if a person is more successful, becomes more arrogant. It's called Chesed of Yishmael, he calls it. But the Chesed of Yankov Avinu is Katainti Mikolach Sadeh Mikol Hamas. The closer you are to God Almighty, the humbler you act. And he uses the expression Kol Shu Yoisa Kamei Hu Yoisa Kala. When God gives you greater blessing, that means it's closer to God. The closer you get to God, the less you are. The closer you are to the truth, the less you are. In addition, he wrote a second letter to a variety of different Chassidic rebbes and so on and so forth, announcing the Nes, this great miracle that the government of Russia gave legitimacy to Chassidus. And he made this day into a celebration. Yud Tes Kislev became a day of celebration. And you should know that it's not unique to Chabad. Yud Tes Kislev is a universally Chassidic Yom Tov. All Chassidic groups honor, mark Yud Kislev, they call it. Part of the reason, a significant part of the reason, is because it is the yahrzeit of the Holy Maggid, the Baal Shem Tov's successor, the Doiv Ber of Mezrich. His yahrzeit is also Yud Tes Kislev. But in many Chassidic communities, Yud Tes Kislev is not limited to Chabad. If you have a connection to Chassidus in one way or another, this is a day to commemorate, to celebrate. 2 years later, he was arrested a second time, and he was released from prison. And in the year Tov Samach Beis, 1801, the Alter Rebbe made an official Sudas Chaydoy, an official celebration of his redemption, and he made it into a holiday. The Alter Rebbe predicted that people would be celebrating Yud Tes Kislev till Mashiach comes. The fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe, whose name was Rabbi Shalom Doiv Ber, the fifth Lubavitcher, the Rashab we call him, wrote two very important things about this day. The Rebbe Rashab was a Rebbe, served as a leader of Chassidim from 1882 until 1920. I'm trying to give you a frame of reference. The Alter Rebbe passed away in 1812. This is his great-great-grandson, the Rebbe Rashab, Rebbe Shalom Doiv Ber of Lubavitch. He said two very important things about this date, Yud Tes Kislev. The first is, I'm going to say it in the Yiddish and I'll translate it into English. He says, Ich denk, as the Ike Yefrutza Manesecha Chutza, hat sich angeheben nach Peterburg. I apologize. I'm being rude. So there. It is my opinion, the Rebbe Rashab said, it's my opinion that the true phenomena called Yafutza Mayanesecha Chutza, that the wellsprings of Chassidus should be spread to the outside, begins after Petersburg. That was the Chassidic code for this date. For the Alter Rebbe's arrest of liberation was called Petersburg, after Petersburg. We know, and if you don't know, you should know, and there's a published letter to this effect, that the Baal Shem Tov describes about what you thought. This letter was published in the first Chassidic Sefer ever printed, which was 1781, pardon me. Many years before the Tanya was printed. The first Sfarim of Chassidus were not the Tanya. The first Sefer of Chassidus was called Ben Peiros Yosef, and the Told of Yankov Yosef. And at the beginning of that Sefer, this letter already appears. The Baal Shem Tov wrote a letter describing Aliyat HaNeshama, how his Neshama ascended to heaven at Rosh Hashanah. And it's a very interesting description of what happens when you trip to the other side. And he just, in part, he describes, he comes to the Heichal of Mashiach. He visits Mashiach in his chamber in Lamaila, in Gan Eden. And he says to Mashiach, Tzidkeinu, this is a Lashon HaGemara, Masay Yossi Mad. When will you come? When will Mashiach come? And Mashiach answered him, there's more to the answer. If you want to read the letter in the original, it's not hard to find. You can Google it. You can find it on my website if you're desperate enough. But the letter is not hard to find. There's more details, but this is the thrust of it. Mashiach said to the Baal Shem Tov, I will come when your wellsprings, when your teaching was spread to the outside. Called the idea of spreading Chassidus, the Chassidic teachings, the Chassidic philosophy, and the Chassidic field, the Chassidic neshama, is a prerequisite, is an introduction to the coming of Mashiach. So Mashiach told the Baal Shem Tov. So the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe said that process begins when the Alter Rebbe was released from prison. And this is already narrow. This is not Chassidus as a whole. This is Chabad. Because when the Alter Rebbe was released from prison, he began to teach Chassidus differently. The Chochmah Bina Das, the Chassidic philosophy that we have, which is meant to speak to the mind, not to the heart. Speak first to the mind, and then you go from the mind to the heart. This style of philosophical order, which is rich and beautiful, began in earnest after the Alter Rebbe was released from prison. So the Rebbe Rashab said in Yiddish again, Ich denk, it's my opinion, that the true inyan, the true idea of the dissemination of Chassidus, bringing godliness to the ordinary man in his mind, not just in his heart, begins after the Alter Rebbe was released from prison on Yud Tes Kislev. And the second famous quote from the Rebbe Rashab, it's very famous actually, is that he declared in 1901, 1902, that Yesh Nira Li, that Yud Tes Kislev Rosh Hashanah Ladach. The expression that we have, Yud Tes Kislev is the Rosh Hashanah of Chassidus. It was not declared by the Alter Rebbe, by the person whose liberation we celebrate. It was declared by his great-great-grandson about 120 years ago, exactly 120 years ago, that he announced that this is Rosh Hashanah, it's the head of the year for Chassidus. So Yud Tes Kislev is an important day. We get together, we Farbrengen, we try to talk about what Chassidus is, We try to be moved by the spirit, by the warmth, by the spirituality, the holiness, the soul of Chassidus. And there are actually traditions. There are traditions associated with Kislev. We eat buckwheat, we eat kasher, there's a reason for that. But the Chassidim make a big suda. One of our traditions, as the rabbi mentioned, I'm just going to repeat it again. In Chabad, there's a custom called Chalukat HaShas, Chalukas HaShas, that every community tries to divide the whole Shas, which means everybody has to take a different Mesichteh, which means some people get ones that they don't desire, that's the only way it works. And you have to complete the Mesichteh by the next Yud Tes Kislev. So this is our custom, from Yud Tes Kislev to Yud Tes Kislev, every community divides up the Shas, and if they don't have enough people, they join with another community. If there are too many people, so that more than one person can take each Mesichteh, and you try to complete the whole Shas from one Yud Tes Kislev to the next. And the Rebbe, our Rebbe, explained many times that the halacha is, if two people do a malacha on Shabbos, they're patur. Right? Because the Messiah, halachically, has no mitzvahs. But there's one way that if two people do a malacha, they're chayev. If each one can't do it himself. So the Rebbe says, for most people, it's not realistic to complete the Shas in a year. So you collaborate, you join with other people. And when all of us collectively finish the whole Shas, it's like each one of us completed the Shas each year. This is one of our customs that we have for Yud Tes Kislev. There are others, this is just one of them. And this is what we do Yud Tes Kislev. I'm going to finish with one more story, and then we're going to break. Yeah, and I'm not in charge of the singing. We'll sing whatever we sing. When they came to arrest Alter Rebbe, he was davening. The Alter Rebbe davened Shachis the Yechidus. He davened without a minyan. His davening took him 2 hours, and his davening was fire. When Alter Rebbe would daven, he would hit his hand against the wall till his hands would bleed. They had to pad his walls. His davening was something extraordinary. So they walked into the house and they met the Rebbitzin, whose name is Stedna, that's the Alter Rebbe's wife. And they said to her, "Where is Zalman Barachovich?" So she said, "He's busy." So the officer in charge slapped her. And he slapped her so viciously, he knocked the tooth out of her mouth. He hurt her. He hit her hard. He didn't just humiliate her, he hurt her. So she pointed, "You can go into yourself." Yeah, right. He opens the door. The Alter Rebbe was standing in Talson's film. As soon as he saw the Alter Rebbe, he became filled with Emel V'Fachad, and he very respectfully backed out of the room, and he turned around to the Rebbe and they said, "Yeah, he's busy. When should I come back?" Now his davening took 2 hours. It was a regular Seder, and she said, "Come back in 6 hours." He gave him a little time. The Alter Rebbe would later explain that the Gemara says, "V'ro kol amei ha'ores, ki shem Hashem nikra lecha v'yorem." It's the Gemara Masechta Berachos. "V'ro kol amei ha'ores," the nations of the world will see. Ki shem Hashem nikra lecha, the name of God Almighty is called upon you. V'yoru in Mecca, they will fear you. Elu tefillin sheberosh. It goes to tefillin sheberosh. Because when a person sees me in tefillin sheberosh, he's full of fear. So the Chassid says to the Alter Rebbe, "Rebbe, I wear tefillin every day. No one's afraid of me." So the Alter Rebbe says it doesn't say tefillin she'alarosh, it says tefillin sheberosh. If the tefillin are only on top of your head, no one is afraid. But if you're wearing the tefillin and the tefillin are in your head, then Amei Haaretz are filled with Emel V'Fachad. The Alter Rebbe finished davening. His wife told him what happened, and he ran away. He escaped. He left. And he went to a nearby shtetl. And there's some very interesting stories about that escape. Rabbi Yossi Paltiel, the Rav, I heard tapes of him from bringing Yud Tes Kislev. He sounds like a Chassidic Yid. If you're familiar with the Rav, he had a unique love for Chassidus. So he would tell a story that he had his own personal family, his own mishpacha. The story was his father, Rabbi Moshe Soloveitchik, was the Rav of Chaslavich. Chaslavich was a Chassidic city and a Misnagdish Rav. How does a Chassidic city end up with a Misnagdish Rav? This is a story I heard the Rav tell the story himself. That when the Alter Rebbe ran away, he ran to Chaslavich. And they went to look for him. So we had to hide in a place where the government would not think he would hide. So he went to the house of the Rav, who was a big misnagid, terribly against Chassidus. And the Alter Rebbe hit him. And they didn't even think to look. And this gave the Alter Rebbe the time that he needed to do what he needed to do. So the Chassidim made a takana that in Chaslavich is always going to be a Misnagdish Rav. It was a Chassidic city with a Misnagdish. I heard the Rav tell the story. He said he grew up in a Chassidic shtetl and his father was the Rav, Rabbi Moshe Soloveitchik. He was an incredible God. He was the Rav in Chaslavich. In any case, the Alter Rebbe went to this shtetl and he met one of his Chassidim, a very famous Chassid by the name of Shmuel Munkis. And this exchange is recorded in good sources. The previous Rebbe tells the story to our Rebbe. It's in our Rebbe's personal journal, which was published after Gimel Tammuz. And he says to this Chassid, Shmuel, men is mir gekommen out of Stil. Shmuel, they came to arrest me. So this Chassid, if the Alter Rebbe consulted with him, you can understand that he wasn't just a regular, ordinary man. So Shmuel Munke says, so the Alter Rebbe says to him, "Was sagst du?" So the Rebbe says, "Lass not steal. What do you think? Should I go back and be arrested, or should I run away? I can hide. I can move to Germany." And the Shmuel Munke said to the Alter Rebbe, "Ich halt, lass not steal. I say you go back, be arrested, go to jail, and David will help." So the Alter Rebbe, he was a learned man. He says, "Shmuel says, as I can't, it's pikuach nefesh. It's a risk to my life. It's halachically not allowed." So Shmuel Munke said famously in Yiddish, he said, "Bist du a Rebbe, vet ich kein Keul nit schaden." If you are genuinely a holy master, a Rebbe, a bullet is not going to hurt you. Bist du nit kein Rebbe, and if you're not a Rebbe, you deserve a bullet. Who gave you the right to deprive tens of thousands of Jews of the pleasures of the material world? That's what he said. Who gave you the right to deprive tens of thousands of Jews of the pleasures of the material world? And the Alter Rebbe took his advice, went back, and allowed himself to be arrested. If you know Chassidic history, there was a great tzaddik. It was a Baruch Mezhebusher. He was a biological grandson of the Baal Shem Tovs. He disagreed with the Alter Rebbe on many issues. He was an outspoken opponent, a critic of his. And he met the Alter Rebbe on one occasion. And he said, "You didn't have to go to Petersburg. You could have run your hand," he said in Yiddish, "you could have run your hand across your forehead and been rid of that whole thing." The Alter Rebbe understood that he needed to go to Petersburg. So he was arrested, he sat in jail, and he was released. Now I want to interrupt, I don't want to talk non-stop, but I just want to say one conclusionary thought which is very, very critical. The Alter Rebbe viewed his arrest and liberation as something that had nothing to do with the disputes between Chassidim and Misnagdim. He viewed his arrest and liberation as something that was spiritual. We all believe in Hashgacha Pratis. We all believe that there's God's hand in everything. We believe in an immanent God, an ever-present God, and everything that happens is by the divine hand. Certainly something that happens to a big tzaddik. And the Alter Rebbe saw his arrest as a spiritual attack against Chassidus. So when he went to jail, in his mind, it wasn't the person on this earth that was objecting to what he was doing, it was the Bezdin Shalmaila challenging the legitimacy of Chassidus. And accordingly, when he was released from prison, he interpreted it as not as the vindication of a person against a person, he saw it as the vindication of the idea that his release from prison was a siman, was a sign that the Bezdin Shalmaila, the heavenly forces, had declared the Chassidus is legitimate and deserves to be revealed. And this is really why 220 years later, we're still sitting and celebrating this event. We're not celebrating the Alter Rebbe's arrest and liberation. It happened a long time ago. It's history. We're celebrating it because of how he interpreted it. He interpreted it as being a spiritual event. The arrest was the heavenly courts doubting the right of the great Chassidic Rebbes, the Baal Shem Tov, the Maggid, the Alter Rebbe and his friends to disseminate this new teaching. And his release from prison was interpreted by him as a sign, Milmaila, that the heavens had declared that Chassidus is kosher, and now is the time for it to be revealed. And I want you to know, he made a point of saying that the people who vindicated him were not Jewish. Because he held that when a non-Jew deals with matters of Judaism, he doesn't have free will. In certain Sifrei Musar, it's written that we only have free will when it comes to our mitzvahs. So a Jew has free will when it comes to Tayyag mitzvahs. A non-Jew has free will when it comes to the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Neach, the 7 laws of Noach and their seifim. But a mitzvah which is not yours, you have no free will. So the non-Jews arrested the Alter Rebbe, it wasn't their will, it was the will of God. And when the non-Jews released the Alter Rebbe from prison, it wasn't their will either, it was the will of God. This is how he interpreted it, and this is the spirit of this evening. We're Farbrengen Yud Tes Kislev, not because a guy was arrested and released, because it marks the celebration of the legitimacy of what Chassidus inspires and what Chassidus teaches. And this is real now, very real now, perhaps more than ever. The warmth, the faith, the joy, the humility that Chassidus gives is incredibly important in our lives, in a real practical way. This is why we have this Farbrengen 220 years after the event occurred the first time. Because this is what we're marking, this is what we're celebrating. And I'm hoping that we'll have a shtickle Farbrengen and it'll get warm, we'll sing a nigun, we'll say l'chaim, we'll stay together for more than a few minutes. And maybe we could move ourselves in a favorable direction. I'm going to try my best to talk a little bit about what Chassidus is. And hopefully we could all be moved by the words that we'll share. I want to repeat what the rabbi said. I'm a shameless self-promoter. I just want to mention my website again. If you're not sticking around all night, please just visit me one time. Inside Chassidus. If you don't like it, don't go a second. And please take a look at my website. All I do is teach Chassidus. That's all I do. I have no agenda. L'chaim v'lebracha. Thank you all for coming. It's nice to be inside Chassidus.org. Yeah, thank you. L'chaim v'lebracha. The Jewish people historically have had various tests over the course of our long history. Many tests of different types. And Kayachal, God Almighty, the Eibishter, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, always finds a way to redeem, to heal, to remedy the test that we face. I heard once a taich from a big chassid who had a difficult life. It's worth knowing Yiddish just to hear this in the original. Es setzt sich nicht lieber als ein Gott. You translate it in English, it doesn't have the same resonance. He said, Baruch goyzer kayim, der Eibishter schneit und halt. That's Alman Hecht. Baruch, der Eibishter schneit und halt. It means he tests us, he cuts, he holds. Baruch goyzer kayim. He cuts us and he holds us. The Eibishter didn't have to give us the test in the first place. He chose to give us these nisyonis, and there's a cheshbon, there's not chas v'sholem. Like Cain said, les din v'les dayan chas v'sholem, there's yesh din v'yesh dayan v'yesh elam haba, and all the rest. But historically, Yidden have faced all kinds of tests. Why HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us these tests? When you'll be HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you'll know, which means we don't know, we don't want to know, we're better off being naive and ignorant. People think they want more information than they bargained for. Then when you get the information, it makes you mad, right? Adam and Chava were thinking they were missing out on the information of Das Tevara. They wanted to know what it was about. When they discovered Tevara, they found out that they were better off not knowing. Eitz Chaim was a lot better than Das Tevara. So we don't know why Kayachal HaKadosh Baruch Hu tests, but he tests over and over again. And in each case, he finds a remedy, a tool that heals, that remedies, that offers resolution. In the Middle Ages, as an example, philosophy became very popular, right? Philosophy has been around since the times of the first Beis Hamikdash and before. And you have Greek philosophy, Egyptian philosophy, you have pre-Greek philosophy. Philosophy is what you would call today a secular system of logic, of reason. And in the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, about 1,000 years ago, 1,200 years ago, philosophy became what we would call today the science of its time. It became very popular. And not just great intellectuals, but commoners were also studying philosophy. And as the Rambam writes in the introduction to the Sefer Meiri Nevuchim, that people became mitpalsefim, they became entangled with philosophy, they didn't understand it correctly, and it created all kinds of nisyonos, of tests of faith. And there was what the Mishnah says, the Pasuk says, Eis lases la Hashem me'efedet teresecha. There was a time, there was a need for Gedolei Yisrael to create philosophies that would offer answers to the answers that the secular philosophies brought on Tasa Emes, as the Rambam calls it, the religion of truth. And the Psad and Yehuda Halevi, and the Rambam, and the Yosef Albu, and other Gedolei Yisrael wrote Sifrei Chatir, books of philosophy, explaining Torah according to the the criteria according to the laws, the limitations of abstract logic, of philosophical thinking. And a lot of Jews who had all kinds of confusions and entanglements and doubts had their questions, their nevuchim, right, their perplexions, they're being perplexed, remedied from these svarim. This was the solution at that time. You know, the Mishnah says in the Masechta Chagiga, Ein Dershin. A certain question is not allowed to ask. And the Gedali Yisrael asked the questions that the Mishnah Chagiga says not to ask, because it was Eis Lasas Hashem Tefeinu Teresachav. They didn't ask those questions, didn't give those answers. Many Jews would have been lost. You know, it says in Sfarim, it says in Heilige Sfarim, that there were Jews in the Middle Ages who used to say that Torah Moshe is Torah Hanigla, and Torah Arista is Torah Hanista. There were Jews who said that. Many Jews. That the revealed Torah is Moshe Rabbeinu's Torah. The secret Torah is Torah Arista. Could you imagine Aristotle? So the Gedali Yisrael had to counter that, had to create another way of seeing this. So they wrote Sifrei Hakira, books of philosophy. Then, this was the technique that Chayachal HaKadosh Baruch Hu used at that time and in that place, primarily in the Mediterranean region. European Jews lived in an uncultured world, so nobody was busy with philosophy, so they lived with the Emunah Pshuta. That means Jews in what was called then the German, the Holy Roman Empire, Europe, Ashkenaz. But the Jews who lived in Sfarad, that lived in North Africa and in Asia Minor, which was then the modern world, they needed these antidotes, they needed these solutions to the challenges they faced at that time. I think that it's not too radical a statement to say that the last 3 centuries have been the most difficult in our history. The last 300 years we faced so many incredible tests. I'm talking specifically Lyhadus Ashkenaz. I mean, Lyhadus Sfard is different. But European Jews, Eastern European Jews, Western European Jews, what we went through from the Tsars and from the communists and from Hitler and from the Enlightenment and the age of science and reason and logic and physical proof, Torah, Yiddishkeit, our values, our teachings, and perhaps more than anything else, our faith, our emunah to Hoira in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, our emunah to Hoira in Amitis HaTorah, Teresh B'Ksav, Teresh B'Al Peh, this is divine, has been severely challenged. And many people, including especially particularly intelligent people, have, Rahman al-Islam, had their faith dampened. Challenged, right? It's the proof that you're intellectual is that you're not sure about anything, right? They call it an agnostic. If you're an atheist, you just have a different religion. But if you're smart enough to not be sure, then you're a really smart guy. Now, it's okay not to be sure about all kinds of things. But it's very not okay to not be sure about Yesh Balabayas, Labinazu. This world has a creator and a master. And that he gave us a Torah, Teresh B'Ksav, Teresh B'Al Peh. In these areas, there's not allowed to be any doubt. And Chassidus, Baal Shem Tov, the Heilige Baal Shem Tov, the Holy Baal Shem Tov, is the answer, or one of the answers. That Kayachol was brought into the world at the time that he lived, and he created a derech, a way of life, and a Torah, and a spirit that gives us the koyach to deal with the tests of our generations. The Zusha Hanapola, the great Zusha Hanapola, I'm sure you've heard the name. Zusha Hanapola, when he read the Tanya, the Alter Rebbe would not publish the Tanya without his haskam, with his approval. And when he saw the Tanya, his comment was that the Tanya Kadisha is the Sameh, is the K'teire Sameh Marpe for all the Magevas of Ikvis the B'Shich. In English it translates roughly, it's the K'teires, it's the incense, which is the potion of healing for all the disease, all the plagues of the heels of Mashiach. It's important to me, very important to me, to see if I can impart the Nakuda of Chassidus, this simple point. Chassidus is very involved, and there's a lot of different styles and approaches. Chabad is one, there are others. But the Nakuda of Chassidus, the point of Chassidus is universal. And I'm going to try to communicate this. I want to get this across. I think it's very important to share this. We're sitting here at Yud Tes Kislev, Rosh Hashanah L'Dach, Rosh Hashanah L'Chassidus, to try and share this insight. And I think I'm not going to teach you anything new. I'm just going to fortify what we already all know inherently and instinctively. There was a Jew who was a shliach of the rebbe for 60 years, for many, many, many years. He was Rabbi Zalman Posner. He was a very intelligent man, a big Talmud Chacham, big scholar. And he served as a Rav in a community in Nashville, Tennessee for over 50 years. I don't know exactly how long, for a very, very long time. For his entire adult life. Rabbi Zalman Posner. Zalman Posner was not a rah-rah kind of chassid. You know, Chabad has rah-rah chassidim. I'm sure you bet him, yeah? Zalman Posner was an intellectual. He was soft-spoken, he was thoughtful, he was analytical, he was doubting, he wasn't a yes man, he had his own mind, very bright guy. He was a chassid and a shliach. So this is a story he tells that happened to him when he was around bar mitzvah, a young boy. It's 1941, Tafshin Beis, 5,702. The previous rebbe was living in 770. The previous rebbe, his name was Rabbi Yossi Paltiel. I have his name, I'm named after him. My name is Yossi Paltiel, was in 770, living in New York. He was very physically ill, very limited. And his young son-in-law, who was meant to succeed him, Rabbi Nachum Mendel, had just arrived in New York. He came to America in May or June, and now it's September, it's Rosh Hashanah. The Rebbe, our Rebbe, asks the Kehillah who davened in the shul in 770, is there any place we can do tashlich? You know, in the old shtetl, every shtetl had a river or a lake. You couldn't build a shtetl without water, right? You can't survive. But in a city like New York, without artificial plumbing, there are other ways of acquiring water without having an actual body of water. So he asked, is there a lake nearby where you can actually walk on Rosh Hashanah to do tashlich? In many communities, people go to tashlich. If you have no water nearby, you go to tashlich. So they tell the Rebbe, a mile from 770, or 20 in Muktas, the Botanic Garden, they're still there, by the way. There's a lake, and there's fish. It's an artificial lake, but has fish in it, and people go tashlich. What time is tashlich? 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So 5 o'clock in the afternoon, it's Rosh Hashanah 1941. The Rebbe comes outside, our Rebbe, he wasn't yet the Rebbe, and he sees about 80 men and boys waiting to go to tashlich. Now I need to describe Crown Heights to you then. Brooklyn was the Golden Borough. Brooklyn was the Beverly Hills of New York at that time. You know, once upon a time, Brooklyn was a city unto itself, if you're familiar. But Brooklyn was the place where the rich people lived. And Crown Heights was the Beverly Hills, Sheba Beverly Hills. All the rich Jews lived in Crown Heights. This is 80 years ago. A lot of Yidden were not necessarily frum, but they all spoke Yiddish. For some of them it was the first language. For some of them was the second. They spoke Yiddish, and they were very Jewish. I hate to say those words. Halavai, the Yidden who are not from today were as Jewish as they were. They went to temple, this one to reform. But Rosh Hashanah, everybody went to temple. One kind of a shul or another. The Jews had a conscience. Today, it's literally 4 or 5 generations later. The assimilation is so bad, a person who knows he's Jewish doesn't know the meaning of the word. Doesn't know that it has a chashivas. It's so tragic. It wasn't that way 80 years ago. And Crown Heights was full of these modern Jews. The apartment buildings in Crown Heights were what we call today condominiums. They're very tall ceilings. They're beautiful buildings. Then, they're not so beautiful anymore, but they were beautiful 80 years ago. They were pretty new. And they go out of 770 and they start to walk. The Ramash, as our Rebbe was called then, Ramash is an abbreviation, Rebbe Menachem Schneerson, says this is not how you walk. This is not how you walk. So the Chassidim said to the Rebbe, how do you walk? He says, you make pairs like soldiers, and you march, and he thinks for a second, and he should sink. Now, Lubavitchers are crazy, we know that. But Lubavitchers don't even deny it. Yeah. The worst thing that happened to Lubavitchers, they should become normal, then they're not Lubavitch anymore. But then, this whole craziness was new. Chabad Chassidim should sing in the streets of Crown Heights, not the shtetl of Lubavitch or Varshe or Otvatsk, the streets of Crown Heights. It was so out of place, it was so not respectable, and it was so not politically correct. It didn't fit into the culture at all. But nobody said a word. He was not Rebbe, he was the son-in-law, but they had respect for him. So the whole 80 men walked up Eastern Parkway. It's about a mile, singing. Every window opened. If you know Eastern Parkway, if you know Brooklyn, Eastern Parkway is full of these very tall buildings. 80% Jewish, 70% Jewish. Every window opened. And there were hundreds and hundreds of Jews watching these Michiganers march. They went to Tasha, they sang all the way there. They went into the park. They did their thing and they walked back. But they didn't walk back on Eastern Parkway. They walked back on Union Street or President Street. Because he wanted to meet another set of Jews and disturb their Rosh Hashanah afternoon. Apparently it says in the Hilchos Shlomim, there's a Kabbalistic reason. You don't go back the same way you went. I don't know, this is not my pay grade, but there were reasons, mystical reasons why the Rebbe didn't go back the same way. Bottom line is he went with one street and he met with another. Zalman Posner is a 13-year-old American boy. His father's Nebuch HaChassid, so he's stuck in this march of Mishagoyim. They go to Tashlach singing, they come back to Tashlach singing. Zalman Posner says, in my mind, every single person is looking at me. There's 80 men, everyone's looking, who's that boy singing with the rest of these crazy people? So he says, this is a story that he told many, many times. He says, I learned the power of prayer. He says, I learned the koyach of tefillah. He says, the whole year right now, and next Rosh Hashanah, spare me this indignity. He spoke to the Eibishter, he says, next Rosh Hashanah, please get me out of this. I don't want to march with these people and sing. And the Eibishter heard this tefillah. How did the Eibishter tefillah? There was an old chassid, a very great chassid, whose name was Shmuel Levitin. He was almost 70 years old. He couldn't walk fast, and he also davened very slowly. He said the words very, very slowly. The Rebbe davened very quickly. So he calls all the Zalman. Zalman was one of his Talmidim in the yeshiva. He said, listen, Zalman, I can't walk as fast as the Ramash. I certainly cannot daven as fast as the Ramash. Would you mind walking with me? I can't keep up. But I mind. I'd be delighted. As long as I don't have to march with them. So the Chassidim leave 770. Reb Shmuel and this Reb Zalman Posner walk together. By the time they get to the park, to the garden, to the lake, they're finished already, they're leaving. In other words, they're 15 and 20 minutes behind. I heard, I didn't know Reb Shmuel. Achei Yotza took 5 minutes. He was a very Erlich Yid. Achei Yotza took 5 minutes. A bracha was 60 seconds. You don't see such Jews today. And it wasn't because he was a Pashto, he didn't know even, he was a big God. He was very devout. Every time he made a bracha, he actually thought about God. Everything took him a long time. By the time they're done with Tashlich, it's 20 minutes after the crowd has returned to 770, and Zalman Posner, Rosh Hashanah, and Reb Shmuel walked back on the same street that the Chassidim had walked back some 15 or 20 minutes before. And people had come out of their homes to watch the spectacle. I want you to know this tradition lasted 25 years, way into the Rebbe's Nesias. And it was a tradition. In later years, the people expected it. They waited for it. The Yidden of Crown Heights would wait for the Rebbe to march, and they would open their windows. It became a feature of living in Crown Heights. The reason it stopped is because in 1966 or 67, the Rebbe came to the lake, and there was a whole row of photographers. Every newspaper, photographers. So the Rebbe said, that's it. Next year, if I don't do Tasha, I don't do Tasha, but he's not having his picture taken on Rosh Hashanah. They found one of those pictures. Every newspaper in New York. I mean, remember newspapers? May they rest in peace. Yeah, there used to be newspapers, physical newspapers. They came and took pictures. The New York Times, the New York Post, the Daily News, whatever it was. But for 25 years, this tradition continued, and it moved a lot of people. So Reb Zalman Posner is walking back from Tashlich with an old chassid, Reb Shmuel Levitin, Olav Shalom, and there are Yidden who've come out of their homes to watch the Chassidim march. They haven't yet gone back into the house. As they're walking, a man of about 50 or 60, who's very well dressed, do yarmulke, begili arosh, walks up to the two of them, and he grabs Zalman. Zalman was a 13-year-old boy, grabs him by the collar, and says, "Why are they singing? Why are they singing?" You have to remember, it's also the middle of the war. It's not exactly a regular day. So Zalman thinks to himself, this is God's sense of humor. I didn't have to march, but now I just got to explain it, Shocked to explain it. But before he can say a word, this elderly man says to him, I'll tell you why they're singing. He says, every Jew has a little fire inside here. He points to his chest. But it becomes latent. It becomes dormant. It sleeps. When they walk by, singing, I'm proud to be a Jew. I'm proud to be a Jew. That ember ignited and burst into flames, and he walks away. An elderly, an American Jew or an Americanized European Jew, heard a few Chassidim singing, and it woke up his neshama. So Reb Zalman got a lesson for life. He thought this is some craziness. And he saw the power. We look at ourselves, the famous word that doesn't sort him. That the Meraglim see giants, and the giants looked at us like insects. Because we looked at ourselves as insects. If you think of yourself as an insect, you're an insect. But if you think of yourself as a giant, you're a giant. From Yidden sometimes don't appreciate how important our behavior is and how much respect people have and how much they expect of us. And this little boy, 30, learned that the singing in the street is not stama mishagas, it serves a purpose. And the purpose that it serves, that it wakes up the Jewish soul. This is Chassidus. This story really, in its way, in its time, in its place, tells you what the Baal Shem Tov wished. And I'll try to explain it. We're intelligent, we're smart. The world today is more knowledgeable than ever. The average human being today has too much information that he can even handle. We have information overload. We have no ability to process what's true and what's false, what's important, what's not important. But you go back 150 years, the average person couldn't read. We have so much information. And it makes us intelligent. We are, by and large, pretty smart. Some of us are very smart, some of us are not so smart, but we're also quite knowledgeable, pretty smart. And one of the things that comes along with our intelligence is our ability to question. And we question everything. Some of us sometimes even question our faith, our religion. And we look for answers. We look for answers as Sfarim. We look for answers from our teachers. We look for answers from our community. We look for answers from our parents. And some of us agonize. People agonize. They matanazach. And on average, I would say the more intelligent the person is, the more likely they are to find themselves in a place where there are questions that bother them. Moirin nevuchim. They perplex them. They make their faith complicated, challenged. So there's two solutions. There's really two solutions. One solution is to answer the question. And by the way, questions need to be answered, right? This is common sense, right? The lesson of Pesach is, your kid asks a question, you answer it. It's not a joke. But when you answer a question, you don't necessarily give a person back his faith. You just take away his question. Because when a person has a question and matters of faith, there's the intellectual aspect of it. And then there's the spiritual, the emotional aspect of it. You start to doubt. You have a question, you get an answer, but the question dampened, it made your emunah complicated. The answer doesn't uncomplicate the emunah, it just takes away the source of the complexity. So there's a different approach. There's a different approach. And the different approach is this. Every Jew has an neshama. Every human being has a soul, but every Jew has a Jewish soul, has a neshama. The neshama knows God. The neshama knows God not because it's a big philosopher. The neshama knows God because it sees God. The neshama knows God that it says in the Tanya because it's a part of God. And that neshama, which is a part of God, shows itself to each of us occasionally. In the course of our long lives, each one of us has a moment or two or three when there's a clarity about emes that stumps all questions, that just absolutely eliminates all questions. I'm a Lubavitcher, born and bred. When I was a kid in the 1970s, it was the golden age of the Bali Tshuva in Crown Heights, the golden age. The people who came to Crown Heights then were so intelligent. It was the generation of the hippies. They were a little older. They were such sophisticated, such smart, such deep, such real people. My parents opened up their home to the Bali Tshuva. I met so many interesting people. There were times that my Shabbos meal, my father would ask me to leave the room. It was pretty intense. But I saw many of the great personalities of Chabad. Today, their grandparents, as they were going through the throes of tshuva. When I became a teenager, I was fascinated by the phenomena of tshuva. Why would a person who lives a secular life, who can do whatever he wants, I can't do anything, I'm ultra-Orthodox, I'm Haredi. Why would a person give up that life for this life? When I was 15, 16, 17, I was so taken by the phenomena. Understand why? Because many of the Balei Tshuva were not men in their 30s and 40s who'd lived and experienced life and had an epiphany. They were teenagers just like me. 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds who went off to yeshiva, changed their whole lives, got married, built Yiddish homes. Some of them even became shluchim. The idea of tshuva was beyond my understanding. So when I was in yeshiva, one of the yeshivas in Lubavitch has an upstairs and a downstairs. Upstairs is what they call FFB, from birth, but there's a reason they say it in an abbreviation because it can mean more than one thing. And downstairs the BT, the Balei Tshuva. There's a Gzeira, El Yoinim, Lo Yadul Tachtoinim. The schools didn't mix, unfortunately, but I hung out downstairs. I was very fascinated by the phenomena of tshuva. And I literally asked young men 4 years older than I, 3 years older than I, tell me your story. I wanted to understand it. And some of them I actually wrote down in their journals. It was a very long time ago. I had time to lose it. And when you hear the story of a person doing tshuva, b'derech klal, I'm not going to say it's always true, but it's usually true. There's a moment. There's a build-up. There's things that happen to a certain point, and then there's a moment. In Chabad we call it a yachida moment, a tshuva moment. The fire of the neshama comes to the surface. And this person, doesn't matter where he's coming from and who he was, is metamorphosed in an instant. There's an energy, there's a power, there's a kedusha, there's a tara that is so strong that the human mind can't understand the power. And that triggers the process of tshuva. Balei tshuva get a free pass. I just want to point out, when we use the word Balei tshuva, we're using it wrong. A person who was not raised through, who becomes through, is not about tshuva. He never sinned. He's a tinik shenish b'lebein umas. This is just the colloquial speak. For about 3 months, they're literally holier than a tzaddik. They really are holier than tzaddikim. If you ever watch Balei tshuva, it's the most incredible thing to observe. And then they land, they become just like us. And they struggle like we do. And their biggest struggle is us. They can't deal with our hypocrisy. They have to figure it out. And they spend the rest of their life, wishing they could go back to that space they were in during those few months when God Almighty ignited their soul. You understand? That soul is what Chassidus is after. Chassidus says you don't have to be not from to have a pitalayit. The biggest Talmud Chacham, the biggest Gadol B'Yisrael has a neshama. Here's the deal. If you could experience what that soul experiences, you don't need answers to questions. There are no questions. I had a grandfather, he's deceased many years now. My youngest son is named after him. He's an American-born Jew. He a Torah V'das boy, for the first Torah V'das boys in the 20s and the 30s. His rebbe is Reb Shagafai. He called him Mr. Mendelovich. You're not allowed to call him rabbi. He was Mr. Mendelovich. He's an American boy. He came from Galiciana Chassidim. My elder Zayda, my elder Bab, my great-grandparents, whom I did not know, were also born in America, but they were devout. They were not very learned. They were incredibly devout. With emunah. My grandfather grew up in a home where his father, my great-grandfather, would get fired on Friday because he wouldn't work Shabbos. And there were hundreds of such Yidden in New York at that time. He'd come home to his wife, to my brother, whose name was Chaya. She'd passed away before my mother got married. And he would say, Chaya met mechub gezuk from der Arbeit. I was fired. Now, in many American Jewish homes, when the husband came home on Friday and said, they fired me because we're not going to work Shabbos, the wife said, you're going to work tomorrow morning or I'm slitting your throat. We got to eat. My grandfather said to me, Jesse, you don't know how it feels to come home from school and find your furniture on the sidewalk. In America. They couldn't pay rent. My elder Zaydi would come home. My great-grandfather, his name was Menachem Sturm, Mendel Sturm, would come home and he'd say, Chaya, I was fired. My grandmother would say, Zorg mach nicht, don't worry. The boy nicht, the Leute would get business, the boy nicht, would get provided. God Almighty provided until now. He'll provide further. But understand that in most American Jewish homes, that's not the way it played out. My great-grandmother, she wasn't a learned woman. She never went to Beis Rivka. But she had a fire of Amunah that was not breakable. And this is what he grew up with, my grandfather. So I had a story that I witnessed with my own eyes. It's one of the most important stories in my life. I had an uncle who passed away suddenly at the age of 39. A young man passed away suddenly at the age of 39. And both my grandparents were at weddings. My mother's mother was at a wedding, my father's wedding. So my uncle went to tell my grandmother that her son-in-law had died. My father went to tell my grandfather that his son was dead, and I went along with my father. I was about 20 at the time, and boy was I a know-it-all. I knew everything. I've gotten dumber every day of my life, and I thank God for the increased measure of dumbness. But then I was a know-it-all. We walked into a hall, a wedding hall, a simcha hall. My grandfather was eating chicken, and we came to give him the worst pursuit in the world. I could play that film. I could see every step of it. My grandfather was a very collected man. He wasn't a man. He wasn't reactionary. So he finished his morsel. He cleaned his hands with a napkin, and he walked out. And I knew, as smart as I was, and as much as I was a know-it-all, that the best thing I could do was keep my mouth shut. This was the exchange. My father says to his father-in-law, my Zayda, my grandfather, Dov, that was my uncle's name, Dov. That's it, one word. So my grandfather, without saying a word, swings his hand like this, which meant over, and my father went like this. It was the whole exchange. My father said my uncle's name, and my Zaidi, we called him Zaidi, went like this, and my grandfather says, Ich hab nicht keine Kashas. I have no questions. This is Chassidus. This is what the Baal Shem Tov gave. The Baal Shem Tov understood that if we're going to survive the last few hundred years of Golus, which is full, on the one hand, with Omash Yitzadis, I mean, what have the Jews not endured in the last several centuries? It's unimaginable. Compounded by an attack against faith, by an attack against purity, by an attack against refinement and shame that is so offensive and so mocking, that's the right word. We're not going to do it with philosophy. We're going to do it with faith, with neshama. The Baal Shem Tov's entire MO, what he wished, and every Chassidic group in its way, using its own culture, its own form, its own tradition, its own customs, is after the same end, that a Jew should not be Jewish from his mind, a Jew should be Jewish from his soul. The base of my Jewishness is not that I'm a smart guy and I know a lot of stuff. The base of my Jewishness is that there's a spark, there's a fire inside of me that doesn't have answers to questions, it doesn't have questions in the first place. This is the ganze, I tell you, this is the whole Chassidus. Obviously I'm giving you my version and it's distilled, but I think it's emes. I believe it's emes. Every derech, every movement of Chassidus, some movements of Chassidus focus on frumkeit, some movements of Chassidus focus on joy, some movements of Chassidus focus on love. Whatever flavor, whatever style, whatever tendency of Chassidic life you observe or you're drawn to, the base of it is to circumvent, to go around the mind and the heart to the neshama. You see, we each have a point in our neshama that has that relationship with God. But it's subconscious, it's not on the surface. On the surface, we're intellectual, on the surface, we're smart. On the surface, we live in the world. On the surface, we read the newspapers, or whatever it is that we're reading. And on the surface, there is an incredible amount of uncertainty that's presented to us by our environment, by the people around us, and by the situations that we encounter. And because of all of this, we begin to doubt. We begin to be heavy in our emunah. The Baal Shem Tov said we can't afford it. We can't afford it. A Jew's faith, a Jew's connection to God and to Torah and to mitzvahs and Torah ben Hashemayim has to be light, easy, not heavy. And there's only one way. Whether right now I'm in a spiritual mood Right now, I'm not in particularly a spiritual mood, but I have a spiritual side. I know it. I've experienced it. I've had moments. And we draw from that to raise ourselves higher than, to use the Bishop Hanapel's quote, than all the magefis of Ikvus and Mashiach, all the diseases, all the spiritual plagues that the heel of Mashiach, we are the heel of Mashiach, whether we like it or not, have to encounter, endure, and live with. And the Heilige Baal Shem Tov gave this koyach, Baal Shem Tov gave this energy, this holiness, that allows each of us, in whatever path works for us. For one it's Chabad, for another it's Breslov, for a third it's different Chassidus, whatever Chassidus it is, all Chassidus, I think, comes down to this simple point: to access the place in ourselves where we're higher than the questions. And that doesn't make us foolish, it doesn't make us simpletons, it doesn't make us unintellectual. The Rebbe, our Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, to call him a genius is an insult. The amount that this man knew in Torah and Lahav Mother Chochmas, he knew everything. He was an incredibly intelligent man. So knowledgeable in so many ways. So a great scholar, a professor, said to the Rebbe, how can a person of your intellect be a believer? You're too smart for this. You're not one of those dumb Hasidim who doesn't know anything. You're truly intelligent. How could a person of your intellect be a believer? And the Rebbe's face was like a little boy. You know that? The Rebbe's wife, the Rebbe's Chayamushka, the Rebbe's wife said, when she was asked what she thought was the most outstanding characteristic of her husband, and she said the most outstanding characteristic of her husband, my husband, is his emunah. Not as Abbas Yisrael, not as Torah, not as Sigufim, not as Yeres Hashem, is emunah. So a professor, a smart guy, asked the Rebbe, how could someone with your intellect be a believer? And the Rebbe gave a wonderful answer. He said it's a different skill set. If you think as faith as the evolution of reason, the smarter you are, the less certain you should be. But it's not. Would you say that a musician is intelligent? Would you say that a musician is unintelligent? Would an artist is a smart guy? What's the answer? It's a different field. It's the arts. It's not the sciences. It's a different part of the brain. It's a different aspect that makes us human. It's a different path. The Rebbe said faith is not from reason, it's from the neshama. It's a different part of the person. You can be the greatest intellectual, the smartest guy, and the part of you, which is not about smarts, but it's about direct relationship with God, that has a direct relationship without being burdened by intellect, because it's a different part of the soul, it's a part of the person. This is what the Baal Shem Tov taught. This is what the Baal Shem Tov inspired. This is what the Baal Shem Tov gave. We're celebrating, so to speak, a Rosh Hashanah for Chassidus. It's 288 years old, to be exact, since the official birth of Chassidus. And this is what we Farbrengen about. This is what we wish to lift ourselves up about. Chassidus wants Judaism to be simple. Doesn't make it simplistic. But it's the way it's supposed to be. And everybody knows this. The biggest doubter, the biggest chocham was all kinds of questions, knows moments of truth. He knows moments of truth. He knows what the neshama is. Chassidus says, don't muffle it. Don't quiet it. Give it voice. Let the neshama be what the neshama is meant to be. And Chassidus gives us a koyach, gives us the strength, the ability to live our religious life, our Torah, our mitzvahs, with joy and with energy and without doubt, without cumbersome, without heaviness, because we're not making it come through the challenges and the screen, the prism, the filter of the mind. We let it come directly from the neshama. So l'chaim, I want to say l'chaim to all of us that we should experience this a little bit. We should know what this is. We know, like I said before, I don't think Chassidus says anything we don't already know. Because it's natural to a Jew. But Chassidus says this is where the focus needs to be. This is where this is the nerve you need to press. You need to press the neshama nerve. And let that be the basis of our Jewish identity. I need a little bram from you. L'chaim, thank you all for coming. in the spirit of Chassidus Chabad, L'shon Teva, B'limud Chassidus, B'darka Chassidus, the Kaseva V'sech Haseva, L'chaim L'brach, L'chaim Temimim, L'chaim L'brach. Here's the hard part. According to what I just described, Chassidus is lightning in a bottle. You know? The Neshama is a spark. It's triggered occasionally. But that's all it is. It's an occasional trigger. Unless you're a big tzaddik. Or you're one of those rare people whose tshuva never leaves. You know, like I said to you before, I grew up in Crown Heights. I knew people, I really did, I knew people who never stopped being Bali Tshuva. They were mamish holy. They became frum and they remained Bali Tshuva to the last breath. I didn't know many, but I knew one or two. For most people, this discussion about neshama is not simple. Why? Okay, I know I have a soul. Yeah, I've seen it on occasion. Maybe I haven't seen it in myself. I've seen it in other people. I remember being a kid. I'm talking 15 years old, 16 years old, and I went to Mitzrayim like a good Lubavitcher boy. I go into these offices. You have Yidden in their 50s, and their 60s, and their 70s, and you put film on them, and they cry. I didn't think anything of it. Yeah, of course. You put film on a Jew, he cries. You know how crazy that is. But Cloud, why would a man of 60 years old agree to put film on a boy of 15? It's under Shaila. But you could see real emotion. Of course, yeah. A Yid puts on film, he cries. But that's not our experience. In other words, in life, those special moments of clarity, of light, that we've had, that we know are rare. Like I told you before, I think this is true. I once told this to about tshuva, and he agreed with me. A person does tshuva, for 3 months he's on fire. Mamish, he's higher than a tzaddik. The Gemara says it. The Rambam brings it l'alocha, the Zohar brings it. The Gemara brings 2 opinions. You know that. The Gemara brings 2 opinions. Who's higher, a tzaddik or about tshuva? But the Rambam paskins that well, tshuva is higher than a tzaddik. And certainly the Zohar says so. Chassidus brings it. The Rambam adds a thing which doesn't even say in the Gemara, right? The Gemara says, the Rambam says, the Rambam has the word Yecholim. The Rebbe, of course, assumes that he didn't give in the Gemara. He didn't make it up. The Rambam had a different shas. That a place where Baal Tshuva stands, it's impossible for the tzaddik to be in that place. But for the most Baal Tshuva, there's a few months when they're in that condition, and then they deal with the Yetzer Hara like the rest of us. We certainly deal with the Yetzer Hara, right? Everybody knows. Everybody knows where he's holding. So Chassidus is an idea and it's an ideal. You understand? It's a philosophical truth that a Jew has a soul, and in the soul there are no questions, and that Baal Shem Tov wanted us to live by our soul, so we should raise ourselves above the questions. We can be the smartest guy. You know, I know people who are real scientists, and they've been scientists their whole adult life. They have no issues with faith, none. And then I know people who are pseudo-intellectuals, they come low, and they have all kinds of questions. Because a person who's intelligent, who has Chassidus, doesn't use Chassidus to answer the questions. He uses the Chassidus to separate the questions from his life, from his identity, from his faith. So okay, intellectually I got problems, but those problems don't bother me, because my relationship with God, my religious life is not which means my living, my daily behavior, who I am, is not challenged by that, and not resolved by this. It's separate. But practically, actionably, it's not so simple. You know, everybody has a soul, but everyone has the Yetzer Hara. And the Yetzer Hara seems to rule the day most of the time. Most of us on a regular day have bad moments and good moments. It's not simple, you know. It's not simple. There's a room full of people here, Kanahara. A lot of the people in this room are old enough to have been in the Rebbe's Dalet Amos, been next to the Rebbe. Not everybody, but a lot of us. Near the Rebbe, it was very easy to believe in God. It was kind of hard to doubt. And then you walked out. Next to a Yid, for whom Malakus was Bepshitas, you were near a Jew, for whom God was as real as your fingers. as a dollar bill. So we were all different in his presence. A rebbe, a tzaddik, a neshama klolis, a nosim Yisrael. But then you walk away. When you walk away, you're sachak ala mensch. You're all told a human being. And many of us struggle with the sustaining of Chassidus. You understand? We know what Chassidus is. We want to be Chassidim. We want to have that life. We want to have that light. We want to have that joy. We want to have that clarity. We want to have that simplicity. But it's not easy. It's not simple. It's not poshut. It's an incredibly difficult thing to hold on to. A chassid, I think you could really distill it. A chassid means a Jew who lives by his soul rather than by his mind. I think that's an accurate depiction of the term chassid, whether you're a Baba chassid, a Gera chassid, a Skalena chassid, or a Lubavitcher chassid. I think across the board, that's the definition of the term. A chassid means a Jew who lives by his soul, not by his mind. But to live by your soul is not as simple as having one. It's not as simple as having a moment. It's about a sustainable way of life. It's a way of life. It doesn't only have Shabbos afternoon and Kiddush, you understand? It has Wednesday afternoons, bad moods. And Thursdays, doubts. And Fridays, manoichal, you know. Life's not easy, life's not simple. This is why Chassidus is complex. It's not simple. Chassidus has minhagim, has customs. Every community has different customs. And the customs of Chassidus are very important. In some communities, the dress is very important. In some communities, the food is very important. In Chabad, the Torah is very important. The study of Tanya, the study of Chassidus is very, very important. Singing is a part of Chassidus. Storytelling is a part of Chassidus. The story that the people have told from Tzaddikim. These tools are designed to make Chassidus sustainable. To make Chassidus not a moment, I'm turned on and I'm turned off. It's designed to make Chassidus sustainable. In Chassidus, in Samavov, you have this. There's two terms. There's aliyah and there's histalkus. If you strike a match and there's no air, or you strike a match and you don't have any fuel to attach the match to, in a matter of seconds the fire is gone. The fire lasted such a short period of time, there wasn't even opportunity for there to be any heat. There wasn't enough time. But if you have an atmosphere for oxygen, and you have fuel that you can attach the fire to, over time the fire transitions into heat. Heat is the sustainable form of fire. It's the lasting form of fire. So the two terms that I use is, sometimes you strike a match and it's a stalkus, the fire just goes away. It comes easy and goes easy, so there's nothing, it's not sustained. And then you have aliyah, where the fire is attached to fuel and there's an air, there's oxygen, there's an atmosphere. So the fire gets a chance to attach us to the fuel and create heat. And this is the other side of Chassidus. The other side of Chassidus is how you make Chassidus to a chassid. You make a living human being that's a chassid every day. And Chassidim have bad days like anybody else. Chassidim are not angels. Chassidim have good days and bad days. They have good moods and bad moods. Sometimes they're up, sometimes they're off. Sometimes Chassidim struggle with anybody else. But the wish of a chassid, the aspiration, the attitude, the direction of a chassid is that the neshama should define him. The soul should define him. And the sustaining of Chassidus is what we call Torah Chassidus and Darkei Chassidus. The teachings of Chassidus and the customs of Chassidus. A Farbrengen like this, I'll tell you a cute story. And maybe I will not be guilty of self-incrimination, but I'll tell you the story anyway. Israel had a president, his name was Zalman Shazar. President Shazar. He served between 1963 and 1973. I guess he was the president of the state of Israel. Shazar was not a frum man, but Shazar was a Lubavitcher chassid. He didn't believe in God, but he was a big chassid. A Chassidic apakaydus was a very complicated situation. But he became frum. By the time Shazar died, he was mamish frum. He kept Shabbos and kosher and put on tefillin every day. Shazar built in the Bet HaNasi a Bet Knesset. He built in the president's mansion a shul. He became frum. He was an old Chabadnik, kicked out of the Lubavitch yeshivas in Russia because of his bad ideas, And then later, in America, he met the previous rebbe, then this rebbe, and he became a big chassid. Shazar helped build Chabad in Israel. Chabad in Israel owes a lot to Shazar. He helped them at every turn. I'm talking now in the 50s and the 60s when Israel was very poor. And the allotments of the government were very discriminatory. Shazar had a soft spot for Chabad. He was a Chabadnik from home. And he really, really helped Chabad a lot. He built Kfar Chabad, he helped Kfar Chabad. The Rebbe once said, we needed chickens in Kfar Chabad, you called Shazar, they were chickens. We needed tractors in Kfar Chabad, you called Shazar, they were tractors. We had a Achei Temimim of Beis HaMelech, he was one of ours, and he was in the government, and he helped Chabad a lot. Shazar would visit Kfar Chabad every year on Yud Tes Kislev to make a big Farbrengen. And they would invite many dignitaries, many important people. Shazar was the president of the state, so he was the most important dignitary. He sat at the head table. There's pictures, there's videos of him enjoying the Farbrengen of Yud Tes Kislev. And he would come, there'd be speeches. Some Chassidim would speak, some dignitaries would speak. Shazar would make a big speech about his whole Chabad roots. And everyone would clap, So here's the story. So the Farbrengen lasted till like about midnight. At midnight, the dignitaries would leave, the guests would leave, and then the Chassidim would sit in Farbrengen without the invasion of foreign eyes. So at the end of one of these Farbrengens in Kfar Chabad, the leadership of Kfar Chabad took Shazar, President Shazar, to show him the Kfar, the tour of the village of Kfar Chabad. In those days it was a village. One of the places they took him to was an old man who's now deceased, unfortunately. His name was Zalman Kleiman. If you know Rabbi Denberg, Yossi Denberg from Boca Raton, his wife is a Kleiman. Zalman Kleiman had 3 daughters. He had no sons. I remember Zalman Kleiman. He was always with a Gemara. He sat and learned Torah. Zalman Kleiman was a great artist. He really was a great artist. His art is one of a kind. In a way, he's even better than Hendel Lieberman. Chabad art, the 2 great Chabad artists are Zalman Kleiman and Hendel Lieberman. Zalman Kleiman captured pain and depth more than beauty. And his art it's a reflection of his personality. It's very powerful. He was a boy, he was a bachelor, he was a bacher. And he lived in the old kfar, the old Arab homes. And he had a gallery of his art. So they brought Shazar to look at the Zalman Kleiman's paintings. So they went from painting to painting, so the whole leadership of the kfar, what was his name? Who was the president of Kfar Chabad? Who was the mayor of Kfar Chabad for all the years? Help me out. Shleimke Madanchik, and you saw Leib of all the big machers. And they went from Ramayor Mistame and Ephraim Wolf, all the big important the Chabad leaders. There was a chassid that was very famous, Pinya. You have a Pinya here, Pinya Altes and others. And they walked with Shazar, and they went from painting to painting. And Shazar is asking questions, and Zalman Kleiman is answering his questions. They come to a certain painting, and Shazar says, "Vos is dos." He spoke an old Russian Yiddish. He was a Chabadnik from home. So Zalman Kleiman says, "Das is a Chassidic Farbrengen." What is this? This is a Chassidic Farbrengen. So Shazar says, "You mean this is what we just finished?" He says, No, this is what's going to happen after you leave. This is what's going to happen after you leave. So I don't want that we should be accused that the Farbrengen starts when we finish. It's not a Chassidic Farbrengen. A Chassidic Farbrengen. A Kviyas of Limud Chassidus. Learning Chitas, saying Chitas. The life of Chassidim, the culture, the minhagim, makes the fire hot and sustainable. In other words, if the fire is too bright, it's easy. It makes a big, like it says in the Sefer Yena, bin laila haya, bin laila halach. It lasts a second, it's gone. You want a sustainable fire. To have a sustainable fire, you need fuel, and it should be temperate, it should be sustainable, it should last. And this is why Chassidim have minhagim. This is why Chassidim have a way of life. And to be sure, one of the aspects of the way of life that defines Chassidim, like it says in the Inside Chassidus, Chassid said, Chassidim are very frum. They try to be frum. Instead of eating kosher, they eat glad kosher. Instead of eating cholestam, they eat cholav Yisrael. Instead of eating pas Yisrael. Why? You want to create the classic term in Akeli, a vessel, a seat, for the fire to be sustained. And there's many traditions that Chassidim have, different types, that speak to this, that are part of what creates not a person who has a moment of Chassidus, but a person who lives a life of Chassidus. And it's a job, that's the word. It's not easy. It's avodah. The neshama is easy. The neshama God gave us. The neshama is free. But access to the neshama, the sustainable involvement with our spiritual selves is work. It's work. It's a way of life. To be an effective and a successful chassid means that you keep the fire burning. And there are many, many traditions and many, many attitudes and many, many customs that sustain it. I'm going to give you a few simple ones, basic ones, that define Chassidim. And perhaps the most important, perhaps, the most important is the Chassidim are happy people, joyous people, right? What's the alternative word for joyous people? Huh? Rabbi Barash. What's the other word for joyous, for happy people? Do you know? What's the alternative word for happy? Huh? Naive. Huh? What's the gesagt? Kann ich gehen? Chabad. The alternative word for happy people is fools. Everybody will tell you that the more intelligent the person is, the more melancholy he is. And I understand that. Believe me, I understand it. There was a famous writer in America. What was his name? It's like Aluminum Lebanon himself. A famous writer. Oh, huh? He wrote about the Second World War. He wrote about the Korean War. A famous. He took his life in the end. He was in Cuba. I can't remember his name. Hemingway. He wrote, "Meet an intelligent person, and meet the person who's melancholy. The smarter a person is, the more you understand the world, the more the world steals your joy. The more naive you are, the more simple you are, the easier it is. Life's good. Why? Because I'm stupid." Chassidim aren't fools. But Chassidim do not let the world bring them down. The Chassidic attitude of joy is not consistent with being simple or simplistic. The Chassidic attitude of joy is predicated on living in God's world. I'll tell you a wonderful story. There was a man, you know, his articles are quite famous. Telushkin, when he wrote his book, the Rebbe quotes extensively from his articles. I have the originals. If anybody wants, you'll ask me. I'll send you a PDF of the two articles, if I can find them. I have them someplace on my computer. But his name was Herbert Weiner. Herbert Weiner interviewed the Rebbe in the mid-50s for a classy literary magazine whose name I can never remember. And he spent time in 770. He said to Chadikov, said, Rabbi Chadikov, secretary, I want a chavrusa. I want to learn one of the Bachram. I want to be around the Bavitch. I want to see what it's about. And Rabbi Chadikov thought it was a bad idea. He was afraid that the Bachram would turn him off. But he persevered. No. So they gave him to learn Avraham Hashem. He was all of 16. He was a boichkel. And they learned together and they argued. He sat in 770 for 2 weeks, learning Gemara and Chassidus with a boy a third his age. And Avraham Hashem is very smart. He's very bright. And they argued, and they discussed, and they debated. He had several interviews with the Rebbe. In the 1950s, you can go into the Rebbe's room and talk for an hour. And he records these interviews verbatim, line for line. He wrote a book called 9.5 Mystics about different Chassidic groups. It's a very, very it's a very accurate book. It's meant to depict Chassidus with integrity, not to make them look like fools and idiots, but to actually say what it is. And the section on Chabad is wonderful. It's wonderful. It's before I was born. But you're getting a window into a tiny Lubavitch where the Rebbe was very close to Chassidim, and he could actually discuss things. And he talked to the Rebbe. He had lengthy discourse with the Rebbe on what Chassidus is, and he argued with the Rebbe, and the Rebbe talked to him. In the end of his life, in the 1990s, he was already a retired Reform rabbi. He told the Rebbe, he came to Dollars once, and the Rebbe said to him, it's time to stop being a 9.5. It's time to become a 10. His book is 9.5 Mystics. So when he retired as a rabbi of a Reformed congregation, he got up in his synagogue before he left the last sermon. He says, I need to tell all of you that I am an Orthodox Jew. I'm a from Jew. So the whole community says, Rabbi, we've known for 25 years. You haven't fooled us. With the Achei Temimim mitzvah. But during the course of these interviews, which are published, they're not hard to find. And this is Joseph Telushkin has them in his book, and I have the originals. I can send them to you if you ask me. You send me an email. I give people my card. Rabbi Paltiel is my personal email, and my website is Inside Chassidus.org. If I can find them on my computer. My computer's got a lot of junk on it. I'll send it to you. But he said to the rebbe that I sat in 770 and I talked to the boys, and I says, I find something about the boys. We talk about the kids in their early 20s, not 15-year-olds, 21, 22, 23, 24, young adults. He says, I find them to be naive. He says, young adults, as a rule, are very torn. Kids, life is good, yeah? When you turn 40, when you make it, right? When you have your job and your house and your wife and your kids, in Chabad we call it a balabas. You have one prayer. What's the prayer? That nothing's changed. Nothing should ever change. And we don't see that as a positive thing, but between 25 and 40, you're ben esim lirdef. You got to make a living, you have to establish a business, you have to start a career, you have to find a wife, to build a family. There's a lot of intensity. And that intensity involves a lot of stress. He tells the rabbi, I sit with your boys, they're young adults, they have no stress. They're like kids. There's something missing, there's no tension. So the Rebbe says to this Mr. Rabbi Herbert Weiner, he says, these young men are going to go to the edges of the earth. We're talking the 50s. Chabad was not what Chabad is now. And they're going to deal with all kinds of this situations, and they're going to bring Yiddishkeit to communities that are really very far from Yiddishkeit. There's nothing naive about them. They're tough, and they're persevering, and they know the world, and they're not afraid of it. And then the Rebbe tells one of the most wonderful things. What you're seeing is not a naivete. What you're seeing, says the Rebbe to Rabbi Herbert Weiner, is they haben nicht kein kera. They're not split. They're not torn in half. They're not divided. They don't have the typical two sides, the metaphysical, spiritual, idealistic side, and the pragmatic, practical, survivalist, pessimistic side. There's a harmony in them. That's what the Rebbe told him. The goal of a chassid, Chassidim are not fools, but Chassidim don't let the realities of life steal joy from them. People make a big mistake. People think, I'm happy when life's good. That's not true. I'm happy so life should be good. Joy, the Rambam writes. You know what the Rambam writes is? The Rambam, Mr. Nigler, Mr. Philosopher, writes at the beginning and the end of the laws of Sukkah, Simcha hi avodah gedolah v'avodas hakel. Joy is a difficult and important part of serving God. Being optimistic, being positive about life, is a religious tenet, and it's absolutely at the center of Chassidic life. And it's hard. It's hard to be joyous all the time. Life knocks us down. And a chassid who's tuned into the neshama philosophy that we talked about struggles to sustain an equilibrium of joy. It doesn't mean he doesn't experience life. It doesn't mean he doesn't experience pain. It doesn't mean he doesn't experience fear. It doesn't mean he doesn't experience uncertainty. But he tries to be stronger than it with faith. It's not simple, it's not easy, but it's real. I'm too young to remember the golden age of Chassidim. If I'm in my mid-50s, if I was in my mid-60s, I would tell you I knew Rabbi Shmuel, I knew Rabbi Saul Jacobson, the Temimim. I didn't know too many of the old Chassidim who learned in Lubavitch. I knew a few, very few. One of the personalities that I had the chance to see, personally, I didn't learn in his yeshiva, but I would watch him, I would listen to him, was Mendel Futterfass. Mendel Futterfass passed away in 1995. 1 year and 1 day after Gimel Tammuz. His yard started Dalat Tammuz Tafshin Nun Hey. The Mendel Futafas came from Russia in the mid-60s. He was separated from his wife and his children for 15 years. They left Russia and he went to Siberia. The Mendel Futafas had 10 children, 10. And when he died, he had 1. You understand? He had 10 children. When he died, he had 1. All of his children died before him, except for 1 son who's still alive, though. If you ever saw a man who had more excuses to be miserable, you couldn't find a more suitable, miserable person than Mendel Futafas. He oozed joy. He oozed it at every pore. He walked into a room, everybody around him was uplifted. He was a chassid. He was a real chassid. And when you met him, and you talked to him, and you looked at him, and you listened to him, before he taught you about God, before he taught you about the rebbe, before he taught you about Chassidus, he taught you about joy. The idea that Chassidus teaches as a core value to be a positive person, to be a joyous person. It's hard, because life doesn't afford us it. Life challenges all the time, again and again and again, it never stops. But the neshama doesn't make believe those things don't exist. The neshama says that there's more to it than this. And I think it's a truism to say that a trademark of a chassid is a happy person. Not a simplistic person, not a fool, but simcha. And that simcha, that joy, has a couple of secondary characteristics. One of them is humility. In other words, people who are joyous are not busy with themselves. People busy with themselves are never going to be happy. And the other is faith. In that joy, there is God. And this is a practical, Rabbi, this is a practical translation of what Chassidus is. If a person says, okay, I sit at this Farbrengen, I heard Rabbi Paltiel made a speech, great lecture. By the way, in case you didn't get it yet, my website is Inside Chassidus at I'm sorry, I have no shame. I'm at yeah, please visit my website. But we talked about neshama, we talked about faith, we talked about alakus bepshitas. Actually, practically, the symptom of that is people should be besimcha. You see, everybody, every day has 2 possibilities. Let me share a shtickle Tanya with you, a piece of Tanya. Tanya chapter 31, Perek Lamed Aleph, chapter 31. The Alter Rebbe presents you with an equilibrium, with a mishkal hashava, with a 2-sided scale which is balanced. One side of the scale he calls itzavon haguf, the depression that comes from the body. The other side of the scale he calls simchat hanefesh, the joy of the soul. And he presents you with the hypothesis. And again, you'll open up the Tanya, you're not going to see this version. I'm embellishing, I'm making it serve my purposes, but the words are there. He says, in effect, every human being at every moment has 2 choices. To look at the glass that's half full and look at the glass that's half empty. The glass that's half empty is called itzavin aguf. There's so many reasons to be depressed, to be disappointed, to be afraid, to be unsure. The worst is the uncertainty, Worse than fear and sadness is not being sure. And there's many good reasons for a human being at any moment in his life to be afraid. Then the simchas hanefesh, the joy of the soul. The joy of the soul is not unaware of the uncertainties of the world. But the joy of the soul says, this is not how I'm defined. I'm not defined by these things. You have good days. It's a chassid, a true story, really true story. There was a yid by the name of Meir Simcha Chaim. He was a big chassid. He was a very wealthy man. He was a multi-millionaire. And when the Soviets, when the communists took over Russia, they took everything away from him, everything. And they left him left him penniless. He was an elderly Jew. By the time the Bolsheviks came in the 20s, Meir Simcha was in his 50s. Most of his children were already married with children. And a man who was very wealthy suddenly became destitute. They took his house away from him. He went into his cabinet, he went into his office and he closed the door. And he didn't let anybody in. So people, his children, stood by the door listening what this elderly chassid, by the way, he was a businessman, a very successful businessman, But he was also a god. He was a big lamb, a big Talmid Chacham. When he was young and he became a businessman, everyone was shocked. They expected him to be a big Rav. The Rebbe Marash told him to go into business. He became very wealthy. But he spent the whole day in Beis Medrash. His children ran the business and learned. He was a god. He was a big Talmid Chacham. He closed the door to his room and he said, God Almighty, you took my wealth. Please don't take my mind. You took my wealth. I'm impoverished. I have nothing. I have to deal with the shame. A person who was wealthy for so many years, now he doesn't have bread. Please don't take my mind. This kind of a spirit is a symptom of what Chassidus gave this man. And by the way, he lived another 15 years. And he never lost his spirit. He was the same man. He had no money, but in his head he was still a millionaire. His attitude was still full of energy. Chassidus teaches joy. Chassidus preaches that a person has to find the strength to be joyous, not because life is good, but so that life should be good. Joy is not an effect, it's a cause. It's an attitude. And in real terms, I live in God's world. God is good. Now God plays games with us like you've never seen. Like we've all seen, I should be honest, yeah? We all know the games that God plays. And he tests us. He tests us. Nochanan. He's constantly testing us. And what he's testing is our faith. What he's testing is our joy. And Chassidus gives a koyach. Chassidus inspires and gives an attitude of don't let yourself be defeated by the decisions of life. Maintain an attitude of simcha. And the fact of life is that when a person is happy about a certain situation or sad about that very same situation, the situation is not going to become any better or any worse. But if you approach the challenge of life with simcha, you deal with it much better. And this is what Chassidus wants. Chassidus wants us to create a way that the neshama ideal, which really is a theoretical one. I mean, we don't live with our soul every day, Most people, most of the time, live with the Yetzer Hara. They don't live with holiness unless they're a holy person. But we could live with joy, we could live with optimism, we could live with faith, we could live with energy. And we could also be defeated, we could also lose, we could also be in a bad mood. And Chassidus wants us to be bigger than our situation by accessing our neshama. So this is what I'm trying to say is, in case I haven't made myself clear, is that Chassidus teaches how to live on a neshama level. But Chassidus also tries to teach how to make it realistic, make it sustainable. And a part of that is a Chassidic Farbrengen. A gathering like this, occasionally or more than occasionally, you sit around, you say l'chaim, you talk, you sit together and you share your life and you try to lift each other up. You don't change the reality of life, but you try to change your attitude towards the reality of life. And that gives us a koyach to live our life in a holy way, in a levitic way, in a neshama way. So l'chaim to us that Chassidus we should be Chassidim, Chassidus is a philosophy. Chassidim are real people. The difference between philosophies and real people is philosophies are perfect. Real people are inexact, but real people are real. And when real people figure out how to live a life of joy and energy and meaning, that's more exact than all the theoretical exactness of Chassidus that is written in Sfar. L'chaim v'levracha, l'chaim teimel shalom. What is your name? Yeah, that is the nigga from the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid, not the Rebbe. Tonight there's the Yud Tes the Maggid. The Rebbe Maggid passed away on Tuesday, like this year, Tuesday, Yud Tes Kislev. And on that Tuesday, when he was nostalgic, he said to the Alter Rebbe, Yud Tes Kislev is unser Hilul. Yud Tes Kislev is our Yom Tov. The Maggid passed away that day, the Stalkers of a Tzaddik and considered a Yom Tov. And 36 years later, Rebbe went out of jail. Maggid told him, Yud Tes Kislev is unser Hilul, it's our Yom Tov. And there's a tradition, the Rebbe brought this in his letters, that there's a sefer which is called, this is interesting, a sefer called Sha'al Satshuvas Min HaShamayim, which was written by one of the Rishonim. Rabbi Yankiv the Orleans, it's a city in Italy, I think. The Orleanish. It's in France. And he used to write Sha'al Satshuvas Min HaShamayim. He would write questions, put them under his pillow, and in the morning get an answer. I tried it once before, it didn't work. I lost the paper, couldn't find it. He would write Chassidus, and he printed a whole sefer. There's a Yid, his name was Rabbi Magos, Rabbi was a Gaon Olam, a mamish, a very big Gaon, wrote very special svarim, and he has his own edition of the Chassidus Min HaShamayim, which you can buy from America's. Oh, you that I've cooked. I'm sorry. And this sefer Chassidus Min HaShamayim, which Rabbi Magos, I don't know what the word is, he edited, or he was the oversaw it. He has a long introduction where he addresses the question of Teda Leba Shemayim. You know, if Teda is not allowed to be from heaven, so how could you ask Charles the Teda Leba? The Gemara says Teda Leba Shemayim. So this is Teda Leba Shemayim is a machlekes. You should know. Nobody knows. Rabbi Shua ben Chananya said Teda Leba Shemayim. Not everybody necessarily agrees with Rabbi Shua ben Chananya, and he brings proofs that it's not necessarily halachically true that Teda can't come in Hashemayim. But putting that aside, this Yid wrote, this older Rishonim, Rabbi Yankov the Orleans, wrote a sefer of questions that he would ask and answers that he got on all kinds of issues. It's not a big book, but it's a book. And it's Chuvas of Rishonim, which means the Chuvas don't go on for 10 pages, they go on for 10 lines. There's a lot of questions, a lot of answers. One of the questions that he asks is about Tvilas Ezra. The Mishnah says, the Gemara says, the Ezra Sefer was Masaka that you're not allowed to say Davar Shebekdusha when you're a Balkiri. So the mikveh. And then the Gemara says that they saw that Ein Reiva Tzibu Yechel Lamed Bo, and Batal Takara says. They made the halacha and they changed it. They saw that people can't do it, so they took it back. You could say Davar Shebekdusha even when you're not tired for mikveh. So this Risha, the Yankov the Orleans, asks, Min HaShamayim, we know that Ezra made a takana. And we know that the Takanas Edre was bottled. Is there an Indian in Tvilas Ezra? Is there a reason to go to mikveh today for Dayakeri, even though halachically you don't need to? This is the Shaila. And the tshuva that he got was there's absolutely reason to go to mikveh, because even though the halacha is not like this, there's reasons to do it anyway. And along with this tshuva, it says these words: Hayem Yom Shlishi, Yud Tes Kislev, V'hu Yom B'Seira. This is 700 years old. Today is Tuesday, Yud Tes Kislev, and it's a day for good news. 500 years or 400 years before the Alter Rebbe was born and lived, one of the Rishonim wrote that they told him in Hashamayim that Tuesday Yud Tes Kislev is a Yom B'Seira. So the Rebbe writes this in his letters. The Rebbe was assigned to this. Shaz, who else knows the Shaz Chuvas Min HaShamayim about Yud Tes Kislev except for the Rebbe? And he made a point that the Hakel Yasa Afabite, Yud Tes Kislev is revealed on Yud Tes Kislev Tavkuf Nantes, but the date was always Machon, was always prepared for good things, for good things. Yom B'Seira, for good news. And the good news has to do with Yom of Chassidus, Pnimis HaTorah, Chassidus, Shmosa De'erais. So let's sing noch an again, huh? If I keep quiet, I'll be better. I know, I talk too much. Love is done in the Shosh Nuas from the Baal Shem Tov. If you want to listen to me, go to Inside Chassidus. I won't be able to turn myself off. I have a student who I gave him my card. He says, Rabbi, I can turn you off 20 times. So everybody's got their reasons, but please visit.
All your cards.
My cards, yeah. If anybody wants, this is my website. Dr. Rebbe, it says there's a Sichon Vidikeh Kutzaburim, where it says that the Alter Rebbe had 10 schusim. Alter Rebbe said 10 things that were his schusim and 10 things that caused him magmas nefesh, caused him pain. One of the 10 schusim Alter Rebbe had was a seres hanegunim. Alter Rebbe composed 10 negunim. The question only what they are, because there's more than 10. There's 12 or 13. When the Rebbe taught Tzomah L'Chanafshi, Toshin Yadalid, the Rebbe said that it's nigga from the Alter Rebbe. And the Rebbe Rashab didn't know it. The Rebbe Rashab taught Choni Merazot and Negunim, he didn't teach him Tzomah. The Rebbe's father apparently had from his Gezer, Tzomah L'Chanafshi. Alter Rebbe had 10 Negunim. The Gunim of the Alter Rebbe go into 3 groupings, 3 categories. You have full Negunim, like the Dalet Bovis, Shosh Nuis, Avina Malkeinu. Then you have what's called Tnuis. It's not complete Negunim, it's a musical statement. A tnua means a stanza, a movement. It's One musical statement. And then you have what's called Chabad. That means Nugunim with which the Alter Rebbe davened. And the Chabads, there's 2 or 3 of them. There's a Chabad for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, there's a Chabad for Shabbos and Yom Tov, and there's a Chabad L'Meis Achel. There's different, the Rebbe used to sing Rosh Yom Kippur, he had a Tnuah, which we know it's a rather bitter Tnuah. There's a Shabbos Dikit Tnuah as a Tnuah from Alter Rebbe L'Meis Achel. So you have these 3 categories of Nugunim. Complete Nugunim, you know, it's an example of a Tnuah. Lika Shabbos, a Tnuah. Tzeder Enes, a Tnuah. Kyle Tarig is a Tnuah. Some people say Kel Deidi, but I don't think, the Mendel Marav told us that his father told him that Kel Deidi is for sure not from the Seres Good. And then you have Tnuahs, right? You have Tnuahs. The Rebbe used to sing when he davened. And the later Rebbe used to sing. So we'll sing the Tnuah that everybody knows. I hope you know it, because I don't want to sing alone. I have much of a voice. It's after Rebbe's Tnuah of Chabad for Shabbos, yeah. Ram mama, ram mama, yam mama, The Gemara says that a person is not allowed to say Shmu Azu no, Shmu Azu ain't no. You know, say about Torah, I like this Tikkel Torah more than the other. Right? The Rebbe spoke once in a Maimer. There's a Maimer for Elam, there's 2 Maimer, Elam Mishpatim, but the Rebbe spoke this in also Yishlach. Where the Rebbe said there's a Maimer, Torah Eir, Elam Mishpatim, K'tikne Evedivri, it's a beautiful Maimer. So the Rebbe says it's a Geshmak Maimer, it's a very delicious Maimer. Then the Rebbe said, oh, but the Gemara Zokta, you're not allowed to say Shmu Azu no, Shmu Azu ain't no. This piece of Torah, like, oh, but it's a Geshmak. In other words, you're not allowed to say it, but it's true. So this is one of the stories that I think depicts Chassidus in an incredibly realistic and genuine way. I love this story. It's a Moed in the Kamais. The Rogatchover, the Rogatchover God of Yosef Rosen, who passed away in 1936. He was the Dvinsky Rav. He was the Chassidic Rav in Dvinsk. Dvinsk had a Litvish Rav, an Elamish Rav, the Sameach. He was the Misnagdish Rav. And the Rogatchover was the Chassidic Rav. The Rogatchover was a bigger Talmud Chacham. The Sameach was a bigger mensch. People liked the Sameach. The Sameach was like a father. I had a friend of mine who once met an old Dvinsky Yid. He says, the Rogatchover is nicht gewinnt Karuv. Aruv da sein wie a Tote. The Sameach was a big Goan. He was a nice man, he was a gentleman. People liked him. Rogatchover was a very nervous guy. He was a Goan Oilam, but he had no patience. He was a big chassid, Rogatchover was. When he was a boy, he was an Eloi. He was a prodigy. He had an open head. Whatever he read went in, and he processed. The Rogatchover's depth was historic. I mean, the Rebbe considered him his teacher in England, the Rogatchover. And the Rebbe wrote about the Rogatchover. The Rebbe wrote, "Rambam hoyet the Rabbi moved bevade." The Rogatchover's Rebbe was the Rambam.
Can you explain to Matt who the Rogatchover was? I never heard of him.
Never heard of the Rogatchover? You never heard of him?
No.
Ah. He was a Russian Jew. He was born in 1859. He passed away in 1936.
Yep.
He came from a Chassidic stock, from a Chabad stock. But he was a Talmudist above all else. Meaning, he belonged to the Chassidic camp, but he wasn't devoutly Chassidic. He was much more a scholar. He was incredibly brilliant. He was very, very smart. And he had an incredible memory. And his depth was extraordinary. And he created a new method of Talmudic interpretation that our Rebbe used on every occasion. I mean, the Rebbe almost saw himself as a disciple of the Rogatchover in Nigler. His technique towards Talmudic interpretation was to create philosophical laws, constants. On every issue, he would span the breadth of the Talmud and identify situations where a certain philosophical principle would apply, and he would use the Gemara as a mechanism to enlighten what the Talmud held about these principles. And his entire method revolves around this attitude. And there's books, some of the greatest sages have written commentaries in his books to present his Talmudic theories. The Rebbe used his writings extensively. The Rebbe even used his writings in Mamar Chassidus. He would quote Rogatchover ideas. He was a very original man. The Rebbe said that he was a man who lived, relatively speaking, in our time, who created a new system of interpreting Torah. He was very original. In other words, he provides philosophical form to Talmudic scholarship, which is much more technical. And it's very creative, it's very rich, and it's true. When you and I write it, it's Baba Maisis. When he writes it, his knowledge of the Torah was so vast that his theories hold true throughout the whole Shas. You understand? He didn't make mistakes, he knew it all. When he was young, I mean, in general, he was a very intense man. He was a hyperactive man. No one would call him collected. He was a very agitated man. When he was young, he was particularly agitated. He was young, so the blood boils in everybody, and by him it boiled doubly. So he traveled from shtetl to shtetl in Russia and in Poland, and he went into the Rabbonim. You're talking now the 1850s, 1860s. He was born in 1859. You're talking the 1860s, 1870s. And he would go into Rabbonim, who were considered very prominent, very respectable, and he'd mop the floor with them. He was so far ahead of them that they couldn't even debate. He came to the city but occasionally he'd meet a rabbi who was his sparring partner, and they'd fight like lions, like two lions clashing. In other words, he wasn't the smartest guy in the world, he was one of the smartest guys in the world. He came to Lublin. Lublin, for some reason, always had great Rabbonim. Always. The Rabbonim in Lublin were great Goinim. At that time, the Rav in Lublin was Rav Shneur Zalman Fratkin, Chabad Chassid. It's a Chassidic Chassid. He was named after the Alter Rebbe, who wrote a famous book of responses, Shas L'Tshuvas Teiras Chassid. He spent the last years of his life in Israel, and Halazesin, they made an oil, made an mausoleum on top of his place, because he was an extraordinary man. He was a big chassid and a big goan. So the Rogatchover was about 18 years old. The Teiras Chassid was in his 60s or 70s. It was a whole other generation. So he comes into his house, and he starts to spar. He's starting a fight. He wants to engage in what's called Machon Shel Torah. But the Lublin Rov was a big lam. So they crashed into each other again and again and again. They fought like lions for hours. When he walked out of the house, the Chassid was walking through the streets like he was drunk. He was intoxicated. He was out of his mind. And people heard him muttering as he walked through the streets of Lublin, that alter can learn, that old man can learn, he was overwhelmed. Before he left the Teres Chassid's home, he said to him, okay, I concede. You're my equal or more. But is there anybody else in town worth talking to? Is there anybody else in town that I should go talk to and learning that I'll actually have some kind of parity with, some kind of delight in engagement, in debate? He says, yeah, Lublin had a rebbe. There was a Rav and a rebbe. The Rav was a Chabadnik. The rebbe was a Talmud of the Kotzke, the Ishbitz. His name was Reb Tzadok HaKohen. He's a very famous Chassidic rebbe. He wrote many interesting books. Recently they found the Maimer from the rebbe that we didn't know we had, that there's a very beautiful quote that the only source that they found was Reb Tzadok HaKohen. I went and I bought all his books. I was looking for an excuse, so I was looking for it, and went bought all. His books are very interesting because they deal with topics nobody else talks about. Like every place in Shasta they mention.
Very philosophical.
But also very, very obscure.
Obscure.
His Geoinus was extraordinary. His Yiddikiyas was extraordinary. But the Tzadok HaKohen was a Chassidic rebbe. He wasn't a Chassidic Rav, he was a Chassidic rebbe. What's the difference between a Chassidic Rav and a Chassidic rebbe? Should I tell you?
Tell us all.
Rabbonim Paskin Shailas. They tell you what to do and not to do. A Chassidic rebbe teaches you how to connect to God. It's a whole other situation. It's not the same thing.
It's another level.
It's a whole different level. So this young genius, this incredibly impassioned genius, walks into this holy man's house and he begins to throw pages of Gemara at him. He's trying to goad him. So he's quoting sources that, from one supercomputer to another supercomputer should agitate, should stir the peace of Reb Tzadok HaKohen and get him to respond, and they'll engage in this great debate of Torah. And Reb Tzadok HaKohen is sitting at his table with his hands folded one up the other, looking at him like he's a monkey. And the Rabbi is trying his best to get under his skin. He's throwing one page, he's agitating him. He knows what he's doing, he's trying to get his attention, and the Tzadok is looking at him. So when the Rabbi realizes that this rabbi is not playing, he stops. He wants to have an argument, he wants to have a discussion in Torah, and he doesn't want to talk to him. So he stops. When the Rabbi gets quiet, the Tzadok HaKohen tells the Rabbi what I think is one of the most beautiful, enlightened insights into Chassidic thinking, Chassidic life. I'll tell it to you in Yiddish and in English. He says, "Junger Mann, ich bin einmal euch gewesen als wie dir. Gefahren über die Welt und gewissen, dass keine kennenlernen. Aber es ist nicht kein Derech. Geh gefinst dich an Reben, soll die Reus lernen, wie wir da verdienen in dem Ewigsten." In English this means, young man, I used to be just like you. I ran around telling everybody they're ignorant. I'm smarter than everybody. But it's not a life. It's not a life. It's not a life. It's nothing. It's ego. It's go find yourself a rebbe, let him teach you how to serve God. That's it.
Yep.
Right? Big scholars, great brains, need a rebbe more than people like us. We need a rebbe. Why? Because we don't know how to learn a page of Gemara without help, yeah? But the big geniuses think that they're self-sustaining, that they're on their own. The rebbe used to use the expression, "Sam sapozhnik," I can do it by myself. Everybody needs a rebbe. Most of us need a rebbe to teach us how to learn the Torah. Some of us have an easy time learning the Torah, but we have a much more difficult time figuring out how to serve God, how to engage with the Eibishter with intimacy, have a personal relationship with the Eibishter. And the Rabbi listened. He listened. He started going to the Kappas. He found himself a rebbe, and he went to the same Chassidic gezer that his father had belonged, that he sort of distanced himself from because he saw himself more as scholar than Chassid. He started to go to Kappas, to Rebbe. And later in life, he met the Chabad Rebbe. He met the Rebbe Rashab and then the previous Rebbe. When he met the Rebbe Rashab the first time, that'll be the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe, so his son, the previous Rebbe, the sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe, was very curious to know what his father had to say about the Rebbe Gon. He was literally a legend in his own time. He was a legend during his physical. When he was alive, he was a legend. So when the Rebbe Rashab returned to Lubavitch, his son, the previous Rebbe, said, "Nu Tata, father, what do you have to say about the Rebbe Gon?" So he said, "As Gisach Yerushalayim for Zayin Word." When he speaks, you can, the fear of God is spilling out of it. He was a great intellectual, but there was a lot of God in it, a lot of Eibishter, a lot of God. That's Chassidus. Chassidus means that you never separate your Torah from the Eibishter. Whatever you learn, you hear in the learning Torah that there's an Eibishter. You know the stories that they tell. But Amalek Yidden, these kind of things you don't see anymore because we're all too stupid. We're too smart. We think we're great people. They tell, as kind of had the nicest. A Yid is learned Torah. Omar Rava. What's Omar Rava? God said. Omar Abaye, God said. Right? Beis Shammai, God said. Beis Hillel, God said. Whatever day he quoted, the Eibishter can look. Now, it's not true. Beis Shammai doesn't mean God. Beis Shammai means Beis Shammai. Beis Hillel doesn't mean God. But because we have a belief that Shechina medaberes mitech gereina, and that Ruach HaKodesh, and their words of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, this person had the attitude, and I'm reading the words of Hillel, the Eibishter speaking, the words of Shammai. This is a Chassidic value, it's a Chassidic ideal, to see the Eibishter in everything. And when you're very smart and you're very successful, then you especially need a rebbe. Teaches you Hashem Hashem. I remember as a kid reading, Alter Rebbe was a prodigy. Alter Rebbe, the person whose day we're celebrating, was an incredibly intelligent man. When he met his Rebbe, he was, according to most accounts, 19 and a half years old. Almost 20. Mm-hmm. And he complained to his Rebbe about two things. Number one, I never had a Rebbe, never had a teacher. And number two, I never worked hard in my life at anything. And the Gemara says, "Lo yagaiti v'tasi al tamin." If a person succeeds and didn't work, he didn't succeed. And it bothered him. And the previous Rebbe writes that when he came to Mezrich, he had the Mezrich Magid, he found more of a Rebbe than he could have ever dreamed. And the Magid was great enough to harness and to streamline and to focus the Alter Rebbe. Mm-hmm. And when you read about the love that the Alter Rebbe had to his Rebbe, I'm sure there's many dimensions, but on the simplest levels, the Alter Rebbe loved the Mezrich Magid because the Mezrich Magid maximized him. He taught him how to serve God, which is what it's all about. So l'chaim l'bracha. We're on din in the Meibishten, right? We're on din in the Meibishten. Every day when we daven, I was talking to a guy here before, he said to me, every day when I daven, I try at least for 1 minute to think about the Meibishten. You read all those pages, page after page after page, Baruch Sha'amar and Ashrei, by Baruch David, and Yishtabach, and Bichas Kishman. A trachton in the Meibishten. Chassidus teaches us how it has to be personal. Our relationship with the Eibush has to be personal. Okay, l'chaim l'bracha. So the Maimonic Chassidus and Yud Tes Kislev, a lot of them go on the pasuk Podav V'Shalom Nafshi, right? Chazan Chassidus, like that meaning here. Podav V'Shalom Nafshi Mikrovli Givrab Moyim Modi, right? That's the pasuk. Podav V'Shalom Nafshi, my soul will be healed in peace. Mikrov, from a hand-to-hand battle, Li, that I was having. Ki, the reason I was successful, Givrab Moyim Modi, because many stood with me. The Chazal say, with me, Rab Moyim Modi. Yochid Sherabim Tzrichim Lai. I think it's a text. Yochid, David HaMelech was a Yochid, was indivisible. Sherabim Tzrichim Lai, that many needed him. And there's another Lashon, which is, I think, it's also a Gemara. Anshe Avshalom Hispalalu L'Shleim Mishal David. Avshalom was fighting with David HaMelech. David HaMelech said that Pedic, Lunei, when the war with Avshalom, at the end of his life. So Avshalom's soldiers were davening for David HaMelech's success. So the Maimorim and Podav V'Shalom have two styles. So first of all, the famous part is that the Alter Rebbe said Tilim. It was an Elachit said Tilim. So B'Klau, he said Tilim as it's divided into the days of the month. Like we say Chitas. In other words, over 30 days he finished the whole Tilim. But the Rabbeim, the Nasiim, when there were special circumstances, they said Tilim B'Shoifi. They said extra Tilim. What's Tilim b'Shoifi? They said the Tilim is divided according to the days of the week. According to the days of the week, Kapitel Nun Hey is Tuesday. Alter Rebbe was released in prison on Tuesday. So Alter Rebbe writes in the letter, Kishakarisi b'Sefer Tilim, or saying Tilim, the pasuk Pada b'Shal Nafshi Mekravli Kivrad Mo Yimodi, Koidum Sheeschalti Pasuk Shel Yachaz. I didn't have a chance to start the next pasuk. Yotzasi b'Sholem Hashem Sholem. I went out in peace from the Eibush to the school Sholem. That's what Alter Rebbe writes in the letter. So there's the Maimonim on Pada b'Sholem. There's two types. There's two types of Maimonim on Pada b'Sholem. Sometimes Maimonim Pada b'Sholem go on the Gemara. There's a Gemara Brachas. What's such Pada b'Sholem Nafshi Mekravli Kivrad Mo Yimodi Kol Eisek B'Teira Ubegmilas Chasadim Umispal Lematzibur Mala Ne'alov Ki'ilu Pada'ani Liu Lebonai Mebeinu Musam. In other words, Pada b'Sholem is three things: Teira, Milas Chasadim, which is both from the word Sholem, and Rabbi Mo Yimodi is Chila B'Tzibur. Right? So the Gemara says that Pada b'Sholem means all three kavim: Teira, Milas Chasadim. But some of the Maimonim don't go on the Gemara; they go on the pasuk alone. And the Maimonim they go on the pasuk alone and say Pada b'Sholem means Teira, not all together means Teira. And this Maimonim go like this, these Maimonim like this. The Rebbe and a lot of Maimonim tries to join the two ideas together. But there's a vert. If two people have a fight, a war, and one side wins, you call it peaceful. It's like a shlugman, it's like a hargit, it's like a rango. They wrestled, they fought, they killed. You have kind of peace. How could you have Pada b'Sholem and Krav? They fought. And it was a civil war, Machon. The worst kind of a war is a civil war. How could David HaMelech say, Pada b'Sholem Nafshi Mekrav? You're fighting a war with the people closest to you, with your own son, and when you win, it's called peaceful. It's a very important kasha. When people fight, the Rebbe said once to somebody, in a war, nobody wins. One side loses more than the other, that's all. Everybody loses. You lose one life, you're lost. Winning means, I lost less than my opponent, or I can afford to lose more than my opponent. But nobody wins a war. One side loses more than the other. It's like Pada b'Sholem Nafshi. So there's a gedank, there's a chap, there's a word. It's actually interesting. It makes sense. The gedank is as when two nations fight, yeah, and what side wins? What does the nation that lost think? The loser nation, right? What does it think? I'm going to lick my wounds. I'm going to strengthen my army. I'm going to build new weapons. I'm going to fight again. But the next time I'm going to win, right? There's a word for that, by the way. It's called Europe. The whole history of Europe is a 100-year war, a 30-year war. How do you fight for 100 years? For a 7-year war, they're beating each other up. The loser doesn't lose. Loser takes a day off. Tomorrow I'll fight back. It's called a hatzatat eish. It's a ceasefire. A ceasefire is not the end of a war. It's a cessation of hostilities. It's a suspension of hostilities. When two sides fight, the loser doesn't really lose. He just waits for tomorrow. He'll rebuild his army, right? And of course, one of the things you have to do in war is make the people forget how terrible war is. You wait for the next generation, because the generation that was just bludgeoned doesn't want to fight. But the kids are stupid enough, they don't know what happened. They don't believe what happened. Yeah, war sounds like a fun idea. That's how wars go. The next generation, you fight again. So that war never was over. It was never over. It was suspended. It was interrupted. But sometimes two sides fight, and one side comes up with a weapon, like the atomic bomb, for example, that is so decisive that the loser curses the day he started up. You understand? If two sides fight using the same weapons and the same armies, and one side wins, the other side loses, the loser didn't really lose. He's going to fight tomorrow. But sometimes two sides fight, and one of the two sides has a weapon that the other one cannot match, and the war is over. That's the pasuk. Gam oivov yashlim ime. Your enemy becomes your friend. Not your enemy stops fighting. He becomes your friend. When does your enemy become a friend? When you've got a weapon that he cannot match. So it says in Chassidus, based on the Chazal, David HaMelech fought a war with his son, with his own son, Avshalom. It was a terrible war. And he says, Pada b'Sholem Nafshi, Favos, because David had a secret weapon. And this secret weapon made Avshalom's soldiers wish to lose. What was David's secret weapon? You know what secret weapon was? Tilim. David Melech was an old man. He was 67 years old. He didn't go out to fight. He sat in his house, in his palace. He said Tilim. Yoav ben Tzruya went to fight, but David HaMelech's Tilim got into the heads of Avshalom's soldiers. So when you're used, when two nations are fighting, and one of them has a secret weapon that the other one doesn't have, then you can have Pada B'Shalom. Pada B'Shalom means when the war is over, it's over. Because the loser now wants to be your friend. Not the loser wants to wait till tomorrow to fight again. The loser wants to be your friend. You get, that's the chap. That's the pshat. Pada B'Shalom nafshi mikra. Usually two sides fight, one side wins, the other side loses. It's really one side loses more, one side loses less. The Pada B'Shalom means it's decisive. The victory is final. They're never going to fight again. Like Japan after World War II. It's over, finished. Pada B'Shalom nafshi. Everybody knows what happened after World War I. The war was never over. The Germans prepared themselves and they fight again. After World War II, it was over. It was over. It's finished. That's the concept of Pada B'Shalom. What's the Chassidus of Pada B'Shalom? The Chassidus of Pada B'Shalom is Torah. Torah. Torah is a koyach ruchni that comes into the world. That when the world contends, when the world fights against the Torah, and the Torah wins in such a way that it's never going to lose. That's the pshat. That's not the pasuk. Pada B'Shalom nafshi mikravli. That when the Chassidus came into the world, Alter Rebbe was criticized. And Alter Rebbe said when he went out of jail, Pada B'Shalom, meaning to say, whatever I accomplished, for the sake of Chassidus, for this we're not going to have to fight again. That's the title of this Pada B'Shalom. What's the Pada B'Shalom? And in life this means, and avodas Hashem this means, we fight battles with our Yetzer Hara. Fight battles with our Yetzer Hara. But some things shouldn't be a fight. Some things should be peaceful, shouldn't be a fight. Like Emunah. Such Pada B'Shalom means some of my battles are over forever. Some of the battles you fight again and again and again. I don't got to tell you, right? The Yetzer Hara doesn't get old, doesn't get bored, doesn't get lazy. We get old, we get lazy, we get bored. But some things have to be Pada B'Shalom. And the best example of Pada B'Shalom is chinuch. When we were little, and our parents taught us how to be Jews, the things we learned as a child that we have are forever. The things that we learned later you can forget. But the things that you got when you were a very little kid, they become part. When you raise your children, you want to give them a lot of Yiddishkeit when they're little. They're going to get bigger, they're going to suffer, they're going to struggle. But the more you could put in, what you give your children when they're very small, becomes so elementary to them, becomes so basic to them, it becomes a part of their hard drive, not a part of the software, the hardware, not the software. If you learn as a child, you never forget. And that's our Pada B'Shalom. Alter Rebbe brings in Tanya. Alter Rebbe brings in Tanya that in life we grow. In life we grow. But there's a very big problem with growth. The problem with growth is that when you go from here to here, in the middle you're in a matzah mesukan, you're in a dangerous place. When you want to go from level A to level B, in between A and B, you're in a matzah that you could fall. And Alter Rebbe brings the pasuk, Sheva Yipol Tzadik. When people want to grow, they make mistakes, they fall. So the Alter Rebbe says, the person wants to grow, what does he fall back on? What's his default position? The person wants to go from one level to the next level. And then going from one level to the next level, they have to go away from the first. They have not yet come into the second, and they're in a very vulnerable place. What do they fall back on? Their childhood education. Alter Rebbe says, he brings the pasuk, it's worth taking risks in order to go to a higher level than Rabbi Yossi Hashem, but each time you go from a lower level to a higher level, you're another sakana. What do you fall back on? Your Pada B'Shalom. What's your Pada B'Shalom? What you have from childhood. Meidani, Negel Vaser, Birchsa Shacher, Birchsa Teira, Birchsa Nenin. You understand? That's our Pada B'Shalom. And this is what we need to. Why is it important when the kids are so little? You indoctrinate them. They're little. You make them wear a yarmulke, you make them wear a bracha. Because those things are their Pada B'Shalom. But you give your children when they're little, becomes who they are. And they never forget. I have a gedank. I didn't see it in any book, but I can't imagine that I thought of this first because it's a good idea. How come people don't remember what happened to them in their formative years? What happened when you were 1 year old, and you're 2 years old, and you're 3 years old? You don't remember. Most of our memories are from when we're 5, some are from when we're 4, some are from when we're 3. How come you don't remember what happened to you when you're very little? What the answer is? Because what happened to you at that stage in your life is not a memory. It's you. You remember things that happened to you. What happened to you when you're 2 does bistu. That's the part of the show. When you give your children when they're little, this becomes them. And you can't break it. Even the Yetzer Hara cannot break it. And that's what you fall back on. In life, that's what you fall back on. Okay, L'chaim L'bracha Yidden, I want to thank you all for coming and for participating and for Farbrengen. I want to say this. Inside Chassidus.org. There's one more card on the table, please take it. There should be again Chassidic Life. I saw in a sikh of the rebbe says that the Rebbe Marash had a daughter, his name was Dvira Leah. And she would cry. She would cry. And when she would cry, they wanted her to stop crying, they would give her a candy. So she took the candy and she stopped crying, but she would say, I just want you to know I'm not stopping to cry. I'm taking a break, but I reserve the right to cry tomorrow. So the Rebbe repeated this by Farbrengen, and he says, we're not stopping the Farbrengen. We're making an interruption until the next finish of Farbrengen.